Tonight, I'm bringing you over 3 hours of real Appalachian horror stories. These aren't polished tales or scripted legends. They're experiences people still struggle to explain. Some stories are short, some are incomplete, some end without answers. That's because the people who lived them didn't always understand what was happening, only that something was wrong. Appalachia has places where things don't behave the way they should, where sounds come from nowhere, where being watched feels normal. If you stay through this video, listen closely to what repeats across different stories, and if one of them stays with you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and which moment unsettled you the most. Now let's begin. I lost my wife in March. Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, and I watched her get smaller and quieter until one morning she just didn't wake up. Our daughter Emma was only 4 years old, too young to really understand what forever meant, too young to stop asking when mommy was coming home. By June, I couldn't stay in our house anymore. Everything reminded me of her, the coffee mug she used every morning, the books on her nightstand, the way the light came through the kitchen window at exactly the angle where she used to stand and look out at the garden. I needed to get away. I needed Emma to get away. So I packed up the car and decided we'd drive to my brother's place in Tennessee. He had kids around Emma's age. I thought maybe being around family would help. We left on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't plan the route very carefully. I just wanted to drive and not think too much. Emma was in her car seat in the back, playing with her stuffed rabbit and humming to herself. She'd been so quiet since her mom died. Hearing her hum made something in my chest ache, but it was a good ache. It meant she was still in there somewhere. We drove for about 5 hours before it started getting dark. I'd meant to stop earlier, maybe get a motel room and start fresh in the morning, but I kept pushing. I told myself we could make it a little farther, just a little more. I think I was afraid that if I stopped, I'd have to think, and I didn't want to think. By 8 o'clock, it was completely dark. We were on a 2-lane highway that cut through heavy woods. No streetlights, no houses, just my headlights and the broken white line down the middle of the road. Emma had fallen asleep about an hour earlier, and the car was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional truck passing in the opposite direction. I needed to use the bathroom. I'd needed to for the last 30 minutes, but I kept hoping I'd see a gas station or a rest stop. Nothing came. Finally, I couldn't wait anymore. I pulled off onto a wide shoulder where the trees pulled back a little from the road. I put the car in park and left the engine running so the headlights would stay on. I looked back at Emma. She was still asleep, her head tilted to one side, the rabbit clutched against her chest. I thought about waking her up and bringing her with me, but she looked so peaceful, and I'd only be gone for a minute. Less than a minute. I'd go maybe 20 feet into the trees, and I'd be able to see the car the whole time. I got out and closed the door quietly. The air was cool and smelled like pine and damp earth. I could hear insects buzzing and something moving in the underbrush farther off. I walked a little way into the trees, just far enough to be out of sight of the road, and that's when I saw the light. It was deeper in the woods, maybe 50 yards away, a soft yellowish glow that moved slowly between the trees. At first I thought it was a flashlight, maybe another traveler or a hunter, but it didn't move like a flashlight. It drifted, it swayed, and it was completely silent. I stood there watching it. I don't know why I didn't just turn around and go back to the car. I should have, but I was curious. Or maybe I was just so tired and numb that I wasn't thinking clearly. I took a step toward it, then another. The light moved farther away, deeper into the woods. I followed it. I told myself I'd only go a little farther, just to see what it was, just to understand. I walked maybe 30 or 40 yards, my eyes locked on that light. It stayed just out of reach, always moving, always pulling me forward. The trees got thicker. The ground got softer under my feet. I could barely hear the highway anymore. Then I heard Emma scream. It was a sound I'd never heard her make before. High and sharp and full of terror. Every part of my body went cold. I turned and ran back toward the car, crashing through branches and tripping over roots. I couldn't see the headlights. I couldn't see anything. I'd gone farther than I thought. I kept running, my lungs burning, Emma's screams getting louder. Finally, I broke through the trees and saw the car. The driver's side door was still closed. The passenger door was open, and there was a man leaning into the back seat. I didn't think. I just ran. I slammed into him at full speed and knocked him away from the car. He stumbled backward and dropped Emma. She hit the ground hard and kept screaming. I grabbed her and pulled her against me, and then I turned to look at the man. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. I couldn't see his face clearly. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a second, breathing hard. Then he turned and ran into the woods. I didn't chase him. I got Emma into the car and locked all the doors. She was sobbing and shaking. her arms wrapped around my neck so tight I could barely breathe. I held her and checked her over. No blood, no bruises. He hadn't hurt her, he'd just grabbed her. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't have a signal. I needed to get out of there. I needed to get somewhere with lights and people and help. I put the car in drive and floored it. Emma cried for the next 20 miles until we reached a small town with a gas station. I pulled in under the bright, fluorescent lights and finally called 911. The police came and took a statement. They searched the area the next morning but didn't find anyone. They asked me why I'd left my daughter alone in the car. I didn't have a good answer. I told them about the light in the woods, and they looked at each other in a way that made me feel stupid and ashamed. One of them said it was probably swamp gas or a reflection. The other one said people sometimes use lights to lure drivers off the road, to distract them, to make them leave their vehicles. I don't know what that light was. I don't know if it was natural or if someone was holding it, leading me away on purpose. All I know is that I left my daughter alone in a car on a dark road in the middle of nowhere because I was curious about something that didn't matter. I almost lost her. In the few seconds I was gone, someone tried to take her from me. If I'd walked a little farther, if I'd followed that light just a little longer, I would have come back to an empty car, and I would have spent the rest of my life knowing it was my fault. Emma doesn't talk about that night. She's 6 now, and when I ask her if she remembers, she just shakes her head and changes the subject. But sometimes she wakes up crying, and when I go to her room, she won't let me turn off the light. I don't drive at night anymore if I can help it, and I never ever leave her alone. Not for a second. Not for any reason. Because I learned that the worst things don't happen when you're being careless or reckless. They happen in the few seconds when you think everything is fine. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. In the fall of 2019, I was burned out completely. Couldn't think, couldn't sleep, couldn't even sit still without my skin crawling. So, I took some time off work. A buddy of mine, Ree, knew a guy who apparently had a cabin in the mountains near a little town called Harper's Bend. Said it was his uncle's place. Barely used anymore, but stocked, and ready if I needed quiet. Reese vouched for it, and honestly, I was desperate. I said yes without asking much. I drove up alone, 4 hours out, no traffic. I pulled up to the cabin around 4:00 p.m. It looked fine. A bit old, sure, but sturdy. Wood exterior, narrow chimney, surrounded by thick forest on every side. Not much of a yard, just trees right up to the porch. No signal. On my phone, but that was part of the appeal. I needed to unplug. A guy was already waiting there. Introduced himself as Micah, said he was the caretaker. Mid-40s maybe. Real thin, long dark hair, kind of papery skin. Like he's been through a few too many sunburns. Something about him was off. He smiled a lot, but it was wrong. The kind of smile that doesn't touch the eyes. You'll have the place to yourself, he said. I live nearby. Just holler if you need anything. I thanked him, and before I could ask anything else, he turned and walked off into the woods. No car, no path, just gone. The first night I actually slept pretty well. The silence was heavy, but in a good way. No cars, no neighbors, no buzzing phone. I lit the fireplace, read for a bit, had a couple bourbons and knocked out early. Second night, I heard the knocking. 3 soft taps. Just after 10 a.m. came from the window near the kitchen sink. I paused, waited, thought maybe I imagined it, but it had been real. 3 knocks. Deliberate. I went over and looked outside with a flashlight. Nothing. Just trees and dark. Could have been a branch, maybe even a squirrel. Third night, same thing. But this time, the sound came from a different window. Same pattern. 3 knocks, then silence. I didn't go look right away. I stood in the middle of the cabin holding the flashlight, breathing too loud, telling myself it was nothing. I finally checked, and again no one, just forest, still as ever. Later that same night, I saw Micah standing just inside the tree line. Far, enough that I couldn't make out his face, but close enough that I knew it was him. No light, no movement, just standing there facing the cabin. I stepped outside and called his name. He didn't answer. He didn't move. Then, like someone hitting rewind, he backed up into the trees until I couldn't see him anymore. I barely slept that night. By morning, I was done. I packed my bag before breakfast and decided I'd hike out. I'd figure out a ride later. I opened the door to leave, and Michael was standing right there, not moving, just inches from the door. "You said you were leaving tomorrow," he said. His voice wasn't right, like someone trying to imitate a voice they'd only ever heard. through a wall. Too smooth in the wrong places, like it was stitched together. Changed my mind, I said. I kept my tone even. My heart was doing its best to break out of my ribs, didn't sleep well. He smiled wide. Too wide. No teeth. Just this dark, Weddell-looking space where his mouth should have been. There's nothing out there for you, he said. Then he turned and walked off around the cabin. I slammed the door and locked it. I tried calling Reese, straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, nothing. I sat there for maybe an hour just pacing, talking to myself, telling myself it was just some weird caretaker who took his job too seriously. And then I heard it from the back room. My voice calling my name. I didn't even pause. I grabbed my stuff and ran out the front door down the hill, into the woods. No trail, just going downhill because I figured the road had to be that way. I kept moving until my legs gave out and I fell face first into some gravel. Turns out I was a few hundred yards from a ranger station. I told him I'd gotten lost hiking. Didn't say anything else. Back home, I asked Ree what the hell kind of setup that was. He looked at me like I was making it up. What cabin? He said the one near Harper's Bend. You said your friend's uncle? I don't have any friends with property out there. He said I've never even heard of Harper's Bend. I don't know where I stayed. I don't know who or what Micah really was, but I know this. He wasn't human, and I don't think that cabin belongs to anyone at. If the story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let me know how it made you feel. And if there's anything you think could be improved, your suggestions are always welcome. And don't go anywhere because the next stories are even more disturbing. In 2022, during the winter, I was living near Dante, Virginia. I thought I understood the area, but something that happened back then proved me wrong. My name is Brenda. I'm 53 years old, and I work as an audio archivist for a regional historical society. My job involves traveling to rural areas and recording oral histories, folk songs, and local stories before they're lost to time. I was in Dante, a former coal town in Russell County, to record interviews with retired miners about their experiences. The Historical Society had arranged for me to stay in a small house owned by a man named Raymond, who had worked in the mines for 40 years before they closed. He lived next door and had converted his mother's old house into a short-term rental. I spent my days conducting interviews and my evenings reviewing the recordings. On my fourth night there, I noticed something strange in the audio files. There was a faint background sound I hadn't heard during the actual interviews. A rhythmic tapping, like someone sending Morse code. I isolated the sound and amplified it. It was definitely a pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, pause, tap, 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 tap. It repeated throughout the entire interview, a constant rhythm beneath the voices. I checked all my equipment. Everything was functioning normally. I listened to recordings from previous days. The tapping was there too, in every interview, every recording I'd made since arriving in Dante. I asked Raymond about it the next morning. He invited me into his house and poured coffee while I explained the sound. He listened carefully, then took me to his basement. In the corner of the basement, mounted on the wall, was an old telegraph wire. It was original to the house, he explained, installed in the 1920s when Dante was a booming coal town, and telegraph was the fastest communication. The wire hadn't been active in decades, but Raymond's father had refused to remove it, said it was part of history. Raymond walked over to the wire and touched it. I can feel it sometimes, he said. Vibrations, like something still trying to send messages. My father said it never stopped. Even after the telegraph office closed, even after the system was shut down, this wire kept carrying signals. Signals from where? I asked. He shrugged. The mines, maybe. There were telegraph lines running underground, connecting different shafts and offices. When the mines closed, nobody removed them. They're still down there, miles of wire running through abandoned tunnels. That night, I set up recording equipment in Raymond's basement, positioned near the telegraph wire. I let it record for 8 hours while I slept. The next morning, I transferred the audio to my laptop and began analyzing it. The tapping was there, much louder and clearer than in my interview recordings, and it was definitely Morse code. I'm not an expert, but I know the basics. I spent the morning transcribing the patterns, converting the taps into letters. The message repeated over and over. Shift ended. Waiting for transport. Still below. Shift ended. Waiting for transport. Still below. The same message, cycling continuously for 8 hours. I showed Raymond my transcription. His face went pale. He asked me to stop recording, to stop listening to the wire. When I asked why, he told me about the Clinchfield mine disaster. In March 1932, there was an explosion in the Clinchfield mine just outside Dante. 38 men were trapped underground. Rescue efforts went on for 6 days. The telegraph system was still functioning in some parts of the mine, and the trapped men sent messages up to the surface, reporting their status, asking for help, counting down their remaining supplies. On the 6th day, the messages stopped. When rescuers finally reached the trapped section 3 days later, all 38 men were dead. The official cause was listed as suffocation due to toxic gas. But according to Raymond's father, who had been part of the rescue team, something was wrong with the scene they found. The men weren't where they should have been. The telegraph station in that section showed signs of recent use, messages written on scraps of paper scattered around. But the final messages, the ones written just before the men died, weren't desperate pleas for rescue. They were coordinates, lists of numbers that didn't correspond to any location in the mine. And the strangest detail, all 38 men were found with their hands on the telegraph wire, like they'd been trying to send one final message when they died. Raymond's father believed the men were still sending that message, that somehow their final act of gripping the wire had bound them to it, trapped them in the copper and insulation, forever trying to communicate something they'd discovered in those final moments underground. I should have stopped investigating then, but I'm an archivist. Mystery documentation is what I do. I spent the next week recording the wire continuously, transcribing every message. The message changed. It was no longer just shift ended, waiting for transport, still below. New phrases appeared. Found something. Not supposed to be here. It's alive down here. Don't open the sealed shaft. Tell them we know. I researched sealed shafts in the Clinchfield mine. After the disaster, 3 sections were permanently sealed with concrete, marked as unstable and dangerous. The official records said the seals were necessary to prevent collapse. But Raymond told me his father believed the seals were hiding something, that the miners had discovered something in those deep shafts that the company wanted kept secret. I became obsessed. I set up multiple recorders in Raymond's basement, capturing the wire from different angles, different times of day. The messages grew more detailed, more urgent. One recording captured the sequence. We see it moving. It knows we're here. It's coming closer. We're trying to warn them. The wire is the only way out. We went into the wire. We're in the wire now. We're traveling through the wire. We're looking for the end. I played that recording for Raymond. He unplugged every piece of my equipment and told me to stop. Told me that his father had warned him never to listen too closely to the wire, that the men trapped inside were looking for a way out, and if you listened too long, if you connected yourself to their signal, they might find you. Find me how? I asked. Through the recording equipment, Raymond said. You're creating a connection. Your microphones pick up their signal, transfer it to your devices, into your computer, into your headphones. You're building a bridge from the wire to yourself, and they're looking for any way out of the wire, any path back to the surface. I thought he was being superstitious. I continued recording, now more fascinated than ever. I started recording the wire 24 hours a day, reviewing hours of audio, transcribing every message. The phrases became more complex, more aware. Brenda, one message said. My name is Joseph Miller. I died in 1932. I've been in the wire for 90 years. I can hear you listening. I know you're there. Please help us get out. It knew my name. It knew I was listening. The wire, or the men in the wire, or whatever had absorbed their consciousness 90 years ago, was aware of me specifically. More names followed. Thomas Carr, William Hutchins, Robert Dale, Frank Morrison, all names from the disaster list. 38 men, all identifying themselves, all asking for help, all trapped in the telegraph wire. Then the messages changed again. They became instructions. Disconnect your devices. Stop recording. We're too close now. If we reach your equipment, we can move through it. We can follow the signal. We can reach where you are. I finally listened. I unplugged everything, disconnected all my recorders, shut down my laptop. I packed my equipment and told Raymond I was leaving. But it was too late. The bridge had already been built. That night, alone in the rental house, I heard tapping on the pipes. The same rhythm, the same Morse code pattern. The wire in Raymond's basement was connected to the old water pipes, And those pipes ran to every house in the neighborhood, including the one I was staying in. The men in the wire had found a path to me. I turned on my faucet and the tapping got louder, more insistent. I could feel vibration in the metal, like dozens of hands gripping the pipes from inside, trying to climb through the plumbing toward me. I ran next door and woke Raymond. He came back with me and listened to the pipes. His face confirmed what I already knew. "They're in your house now," he said. "They followed the connection. Once they reach your location, they'll start looking for a way out. A way to manifest physically." "How do I stop it?" I asked. "You can't," he said. "You invited them in by listening. Now they know where you are. Best thing you can do is leave. Leave tonight. Don't tell them where you're going. Don't use any connected device they could follow." I packed and left within an hour. I drove to a hotel in Abingdon, paying cash, using no credit cards or phone calls that could be traced. I left all my recording equipment behind, but I can still hear them. Not in pipes or wires, but in electronic devices. My phone sometimes picks up faint tapping sounds beneath normal calls. My laptop speakers occasionally emit rhythmic clicks when nothing is playing. My car radio, between stations, sometimes captures fragments of Morse code. The men in the wire are still looking for me. They know I listened to them, know I tried to help them, and now they want me to complete what I started. They want me to free them from the wire, to give them a path back to the physical world. 2 weeks after leaving Dante, I received a package at my home address. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a piece of copper wire, about 6 inches long, wrapped in a piece of paper. The paper had a message written in pencil. "We found your home. We're in your wiring now. We're close, Brenda. So close. Just touch the wire. Help us out." I called an electrician and had every wire in my house replaced. Cost me $8,000. For a month, things were quiet. No tapping, no messages, no signs of the men in the wire. Then I started hearing them in other places. Store intercoms, traffic lights, ATM machines, any system with electrical wiring. The men weren't just in old telegraph lines anymore. They'd learned to move through modern electrical systems, spreading through power grids, adapting to new technology. And they were still looking for me. Last week I heard my name in the tapping pattern coming from a streetlight. "Brenda, we remember you. We're everywhere now. Everywhere there's wire, we can be. And eventually, we'll find our way out. Through someone. Through something. Maybe through you. I don't know how to stop them. I don't know if they can be stopped. 90 years ago, 38 men died gripping a telegraph wire in a sealed mine shaft, trying to warn the world about something they'd discovered in the dark. Now, they're trapped in the wire itself, spreading through electrical systems, looking for any path back to the world they left behind. And I'm the one who listened. I'm the one who built the bridge. I'm the one they're hunting. And I think they're going to emerge through me, because I'm the one who listened. Every wire in every wall carries their signal now. Every electrical device is a potential doorway. And somewhere in that vast network of copper and current, 38 men are moving closer, learning how to cross from the wire into the world. And when they finally figure it out, when they finally find the right path, the right person, the right moment, they're going to emerge. All of them. 38 men who died in 1932, preserved in electrical current, coming back to a world they don't understand. I was 9 years old when my world fell apart. I came home from school that Tuesday afternoon and found Mom sitting at the kitchen table with Grandpa. The moment I saw their faces, I knew something was terribly wrong. They sat me down and told me Dad was missing. He and Uncle Lee had gone hunting that weekend in the woods. East of Quetta, they were maybe half a mile in when Dad realized he'd forgotten his grunt call in the truck. You know, one of those devices that sounds like a buck. He told Uncle Lee to wait right there and headed back to get it. That was the last time anyone saw him, Uncle. Lee said he waited 20 or 30 minutes before worry set in. He walked back to the truck, but Dad wasn't there. By the time night fell, Uncle Lee had called in every deputy from McDowell County. They searched those hills for 2 solid weeks. 2 weeks of hoping, praying, waiting for any news. But they found nothing. Not a single trace. Eventually, the sheriff had to call off the search. Mom kept Dad's name on the missing persons list for years. Our whole family pooled money together to hire a private investigator. The guy was good too, a retired cop from Charleston with an excellent reputation. But after months of work, he could only tell us what the sheriff had already said. The most likely scenario was that Dad had wandered into the old mining area near Cucumber and fallen down a shaft. His body was probably still down there, somewhere in the dark. During the initial search, caving specialists had mapped out every mine shaft they could safely enter. Teams with cadaver dogs went through the tunnels that were too dangerous for people. They never found Dad. The sheriff said that didn't necessarily mean he wasn't down there. Those mines were extensive and parts of them had collapsed over the years, but there was something the sheriff didn't tell Mom. She found out later from the private investigator. Inside one of those mine shafts, someone had spray-painted graffiti all over the walls. Strange symbols and words the investigator didn't recognize. He figured local teenagers used the place as a hangout. He thought maybe those kids knew something about what happened to Dad. Despite his best efforts, he never tracked any of them down. Uncle Lee tried to help however he could. He stayed in close contact with the investigator, but Dad's disappearance hit him harder than anyone. People kept telling him it wasn't his fault, that he did everything right, but he was never the same after that day. No one blamed him for it either. How could we? I didn't get the full story until I was much older. The years between Dad going missing and Mom having him declared legally dead were filled with hope and heartbreak. My sister and I kept asking when Daddy was coming home. It nearly destroyed Mom. As we got older and accepted he was never coming back, it got easier to deal with. The pain faded into the background, but it never really left. It was always there. By the time I turned 22, my sister had moved to Morgantown for college, and I was working full-time at a repair shop in Welch. I hadn't seen Uncle Lee in maybe 4 or 5 years. He sent birthday cards and called on holidays. Sometimes he'd phone Mom around the anniversary of Dad's disappearance, but mostly he kept his distance. He once told Mom that I reminded him too much of Dad. Some memories brought him joy, but most brought pain. I understood, but it hurt knowing I probably wouldn't see much of him anymore. So you can imagine how I felt when Mom said Uncle Lee had called asking to talk to me. I drove out to his place near Filbert on a Saturday. What followed felt like a family reunion. We were genuinely happy to see each other. I'd been worried he'd become some depressed alcoholic, but he was clear-headed and doing well. We caught up over sandwiches and beer. The conversation danced around Dad for a while until we couldn't avoid him anymore. Then Uncle Lee made an unexpected proposal. He asked if I wanted to visit the place where Dad disappeared. He said it might give me closure. He'd been up to those hills east of Quetta about 6 times over the years. He never found anything, but it helped him feel less useless. At first I wasn't interested. I could see why it helped Uncle Lee. But wandering around where my father vanished sounded like torture to me. I was just happy to have my uncle back in my life. After Grandpa died, Uncle Lee was the only father figure I had left. But slowly over the next year, I came around to the idea. I'd been visiting Uncle Lee every couple weeks, and our relationship had grown stronger. Finally, I suggested we make the trip. He seemed happy but restrained, like he didn't want to show too much emotion in case it scared me off. He never asked what changed my mind. If he had, I would have told him the truth. If it got too emotional, we could just turn around and leave. Nothing was forcing us to stay, and if it didn't help, at least I could say I tried. We planned to go on a Saturday morning in early May. We decided to treat it like a regular hike instead of some dark pilgrimage. We'd bring beer and sandwiches like always. If I felt like talking about Dad, we would. If not, that was fine too. I felt anxious as we drove along the creek toward the trailhead. But once we started walking and talking, I realized these woods were just like any other in West Virginia. I'd always thought of the area around Quetta as haunted. Not literally, but the ghost of my dad felt present there. I'd never wanted to visit as long as I lived. So standing there and realizing it was mostly in my head felt liberating. Mostly being the key word, because some part of me still felt like a piece of Dad was out there somewhere. Call it memory or hope or whatever you want, but I felt something. We walked and talked until we reached Big Creek. We sat on a flat rock and took a break. I figured that was the halfway point, so I suggested heading back. But Uncle Lee said there was something he wanted to show me. After another mile, we came to a rocky outcrop, overlooking the abandoned mines I mentioned earlier. I asked if that was the place the private investigator had checked out. Uncle Lee said yes. Then after a long pause, he told me something he'd never told Mom or me. He told the sheriff and the investigator, but never us. The last time he saw Dad was when he watched him walk into one of those mine shafts. Between realizing Dad was missing and calling the authorities, Uncle Lee had run through the woods calling Dad's name. He wasn't much of a tracker, but he got lucky heading in the right direction. He didn't think Dad would have gone toward the mines. But when Uncle Lee stood on that same outcrop where we stood now, he saw a distant figure dressed exactly like Dad, walking into one of the dark tunnels. Uncle Lee said he scrambled down the steep slope and ran toward that mine shaft. When he got there and walked inside with his flashlight, there was no one. I asked if he saw the same graffiti the investigator mentioned. He said no, but something about that mine made him deeply uneasy. That's what had haunted him all these years. The idea that his brother walked into a dark tunnel, heard his name being called, and chose to hide in the darkness. That was the best case scenario. The worst case was that something terrible happened to Dad in that mine. Something that left him unable to walk or talk or respond. I understood why he'd kept that from us. The situation was bad enough without adding more disturbing mystery. But I told Uncle Lee I was glad he shared the truth, even if it was painful. I figured it was time to leave after that, but Uncle Lee had another proposal. He asked if I wanted to walk down to the mine with him. He said he did it occasionally to try to make peace with that place. I couldn't think of a reason not to. We'd already come all that way, and I had no idea if I'd ever return. Not going seemed like a wasted opportunity. If it helped Uncle Lee deal with the heartache, maybe it would help me too. We walked around the edge of the mining pit to find a safe way down. At the bottom, warning signs were hammered into the dirt telling people to keep out. I asked Uncle Lee if he thought Dad had fallen down a shaft or been trapped in a cave-in. He said if that was the case, they would have found the body by now. Whatever happened to Dad happened in that mine. It just hadn't been properly explained. As we got closer to the entrance, the air felt heavier. Very little light penetrated the tunnel. I remember seeing splintered wooden beams jutting out at odd angles like broken teeth. We didn't say a word as we approached. The place was so quiet that our boots crunching on gravel seemed unnaturally loud. I started noticing things. Discarded tools, a cracked lantern, frayed rope half buried in dirt. Everything suggested the mine had been abandoned in a hurry, rather than through an organized shutdown. I asked Uncle Lee why the place was abandoned. He said he'd heard rumors of flooding, but the official story was that the company went out of business. If that was true, why did it look like everyone ran away? As we reached the entrance, the temperature dropped noticeably. The darkness ahead seemed to swallow all outside light after just a few feet. Uncle Lee sensed my hesitation. He told me I didn't have to go inside if I didn't want to. We could just leave, but I wasn't turning back now. Not after coming all this way. I walked toward the entrance and the rusted cage bars of the open gate beyond. I remember how much colder it got as I stepped inside. The air smelled and tasted of dust, metal, and mold all at once. The outside light disappeared quickly. Luckily, I had a tiny flashlight on my keyring. I fumbled to get it free and pressed the button. The weak beam barely pushed back the darkness a few feet. I took a few steps and stopped, then a few more. I turned around to check if Uncle Lee was following. That's when my blood turned to ice. Uncle Lee stood near the gate, almost a silhouette by then. But there was just enough light to see he was holding something. A gun, and the hand holding it was shaking. For a microsecond, part of me wanted to reason with him. There was a brief flicker of hope that he'd pulled the gun for our safety. But the way it trembled in his hand, the way he said absolutely nothing as I looked at him, I knew I wasn't safe at all. So I ran. I ran down that tunnel with my pathetic little flashlight as the first gunshot exploded behind me. The crack split the air and the bang felt like it destroyed my eardrums. I felt the bullet fly past. My adrenaline surged. To avoid being an easy target, I had to turn off my flashlight. When I released the button, I was plunged into complete darkness. I'd never been so terrified in my entire life. I didn't know that level of fear was possible. The only light came from Uncle Lee's muzzle. Flashes as my lungs burned and my muscles screamed. Any second I expected to take a bullet or slam into a wall. I was headed for a wall. The only warning I got was seeing one of Lee's bullets ricochet off something metallic. I flicked on my flashlight for a second and saw the tunnel splitting into 3 directions. I picked one in a split second and kept running. Only when I was out of his sight did I switch the flashlight back on to look for a hiding place. As I ran, the weak beam bounced off the walls. I realized something had been written on them. At first I thought it was the graffiti the investigator mentioned. But even running at full speed, I could see it was unlike any graffiti I'd ever seen. It looked like writing smeared in black paint. An entire section of tunnel was covered in what had to be over 1,000 lines. I didn't recognize the language. I didn't have time to study it. I was looking for somewhere to hide. I found smaller and larger chambers branching off the tunnel. I picked one at random, lunged inside, and tucked into the nearest corner to hide from Lee's flashlight beam. I kept my breathing shallow, but my heart hammered against my ribs. I realized my hiding place did nothing to reduce my terror. Sure, I was out of sight temporarily, but I was trapped. I tried to stay as quiet as possible. For the first few minutes that felt like hours, my ears rang non-stop from the amplified gunshots. I wondered if my hearing would ever return to normal. I imagined Lee creeping up on me without me ever hearing him coming. It was almost a relief when I started hearing his voice and footsteps getting closer. I wasn't deaf. but I was still trapped. Whatever relief I felt was drowned out by the raw terror of being hunted. Lee started calling my name, telling me to come out. He wasn't trying to reason with me or make excuses, just telling me I needed to come out because sooner or later he was going to find me. I couldn't move. The sound of my footsteps would have given away my location, so I had no choice but to stay still and quiet. That part was surprisingly easy, because running all that way in the shape I was happy to catch my breath. When his footsteps got even louder, he suddenly pointed his flashlight down the tunnel where I was hiding. Staying still and quiet got a lot harder in that moment. I remember repeating it over and over in my head with perfect clarity. Don't come down here. Don't come down here. Please God, don't let him find me. And I guess God listened because instead of coming down my tunnel, he just kept walking. I thought that might be my chance to escape. If Lee was heading deeper, maybe I could slip out behind him. But that hope died when I remembered how loud my footsteps would be, and how he might not miss this time. I later found a bullet hole through one of my jacket pockets, but like I was saying, I stayed perfectly still in that dark chamber, keeping my ears tuned for his voice and footsteps. They were still ringing from the shots, and I could hear my heart pulsing in my ears, but it wasn't as bad as before. I could hear almost every word Lee was saying as he continued hunting me. His footsteps were slow and steady. Occasionally he mumbled something I couldn't make out. Then suddenly his footsteps went from slow and rhythmic to sharp and quick, with a scrape of gravel, then silence. It sounded like he'd suddenly turned around, like he heard something that startled him and figured it was me trying to escape. He stayed still for a few moments. A horrible silence hung in the air. Then he said, "I know you're here, Stanley." Hearing those words terrified me in ways I never thought possible. Stanley isn't my name. It was my dad's name. My mind felt like it was fracturing from the combination of terror, confusion, and painful memory. Uncle Lee had lost his mind. There was no other explanation. And the reality of what that meant was almost too much to handle. I wanted more than anything to try and reason with him, to appeal to our sense of family. We'd already lost one man. There was no reason to lose another, especially by his own hand. But I knew that gamble might be the last one I'd ever take. He'd already tried to kill me. Nothing said he wouldn't try again. In the end, I resigned myself to waiting until he came around the corner of my hiding place. I'd rush him and try to get control of that gun. Whatever happened next, I could only hope for the best. But as I listened to his footsteps become slow and steady again, waiting for them to get louder before I saw his flashlight, we both heard the sound of something else moving in those tunnels. I can't tell you who or what it was. They didn't say a word. I didn't hear footsteps. All I heard was what sounded like rocks shifting somewhere deeper in the tunnels. Then Lee started to speak. I couldn't make out what he was saying at first. He just stopped dead still and started muttering under his breath. I had absolutely no clue what was going on. I was terrified, but all I could do was stand there still as a statue and keep my ears tuned because my life depended on it. Lee just kept muttering to himself. Or at least it sounded like he was talking to himself. Then out of nowhere, I felt this rush of warm air blow through the tunnels, like it was coming from deep underground, and it smelled like evil. When I say it smelled like evil, I only use that word instead of death. I was gonna say it smelled like death, but I've come across a rotting deer carcass in high summer before. This wasn't the same scent. It wasn't that sick smell of decay that makes you want to throw up or run or both. It was something so foul it shouldn't exist by any natural law. It smelled like burning death. That's the only way I can describe it. Like something that can't exist on the surface. Something older than the mine itself. I covered my mouth and nose with my shirt because my first thought was toxic gas. The kind I'd read about that miners had to worry about. I remember thinking, so this is why they abandoned this godforsaken place. As I kept my shirt clamped over my mouth and nose, I suddenly heard Lee begin to yell. I can't guarantee these were his exact words, but to my memory he said, "He's here. I brought him. I did what you asked." He repeated himself a lot. Said stuff in between like please or you've gotta believe me. But he said that first part over and over with fits of rage. His screams got louder and louder until I couldn't make out the words anymore. By the time his yells turned into what sounded like screams of pain and terror, I made a run for it, hoping he was distracted. He wasn't anywhere near my tunnel. I didn't even see his flashlight as I ran, but the whole time I was running out of that tunnel at speeds I was sure would end in me falling. I heard Lee's screams. I kept hearing them as I ran out into daylight. They were much fainter with this eerie echo quality, but I could still hear them right up until they suddenly went silent. I didn't look back. I didn't even consider it. I just kept running toward the gentle slope we'd used to climb down into that pit. I scaled it and kept running through the woods until my legs gave out. The woods were quiet, but Uncle Lee's screams kept echoing in my head. I was overtaken by contradictory feelings of trauma and this bizarre sense of victory. I'd made it out, but I couldn't enjoy that feeling because Uncle Lee hadn't. When I couldn't run anymore, I started walking back to my truck. It took a long time before I spotted the glint of metal through the trees. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle. I yanked it open, slid into the driver's seat, and just sat there staring at the windshield. I couldn't process what had just happened. I couldn't feel happy I'd survived. It was just this numb sense of resignation that I had to drive home and report my own attempted murder to the sheriff, along with a single word, why. I could only manage to drive as far as Quetta before I had to stop. There was no way I could drive safely in my condition. It was the first place available to call the sheriff's department. My hands were still shaking when I asked the motel receptionist if I could use their phone. I could tell she was scared of me because of my appearance and behavior, but she let me use it. I didn't try to keep the call private. I lowered my voice, but with her right there, I couldn't keep her from hearing. I told the dispatcher my uncle had tried to kill me at the abandoned mining pit north of Cucumber. I said I thought he'd had some kind of accident and was still inside. I must have sounded completely out of it, but they understood enough to send help. 2 deputies showed up maybe 10 or 15 minutes later. I told them everything. They wrote it all down. They said they'd call me once they checked out the mines. I drove home, took a shower, and tried to process everything. But there was no processing it. Even after all these years, I still haven't been able to. A few hours later, I got a call from one of the deputies. They'd found footprints and shell casings, but no Uncle Lee. What followed was the exact same process as when Dad went missing. The sheriff got search and rescue involved. They explored the mine as deep as it was safe to go. There was no sign of Uncle Lee anywhere. No blood, no body, no weapon. Only those shell casings near the entrance where he'd shot at me. I told them about the rush of warm air and how Lee had started screaming. He's here. I brought him. I did what you asked. After many weeks of investigating and consulting with experts, the sheriff announced their conclusion. In mining, there are things called blowouts or gas blowouts. These involve accidental releases of gases like methane, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, or carbon dioxide, all of which can build up in mines and prove toxic at certain concentrations. They're caused by things like drilling, blasting, and sudden changes in pressure. They cause poisonous gases to rush out like tsunamis of toxic vapor. The sheriff believed Uncle Lee and I had been caught in one of those blowouts. They explained that Lee was likely hit with a gas cocktail, consisting mostly of highly concentrated carbon dioxide. This led to a frightened disorientation which caused him to attack me in his confusion. Given the circumstances, the sheriff told Mom and me that Lee had become the #1 suspect in Dad's disappearance. There had almost certainly been foul play. There had been no activity in Lee's bank account after he disappeared, which was probably the main reason we all thought he was dead rather than just vanished. It was still possible Dad going missing had nothing to do with what Lee did later. But the sheriff said he was very interested in catching up with Lee to find out why he'd called me by my dad's name instead of my own. More than 2 decades have passed now. Not a trace of Uncle Lee or my dad has ever been found. After the sheriff and his people searched the mine, he ordered it sealed off, with explosives to prevent others from suffering the same tragic fate. Their opinion of what Lee's fate was and my own opinion differ greatly. I didn't make a fuss at the time, and I still don't. What I'm writing now is the first objection I've ever put on paper, let alone voiced out loud. But I don't believe for a second it was some rush of carbon dioxide that made Uncle Lee start shooting at me. I told the sheriff back then over and over that the rush of warm air didn't happen as we were walking in. It happened while I was hiding, right before Lee started calling out for my dad and saying all that weird stuff, and eventually screaming. But the sheriff and his experts acted like I got it all wrong, that I was so disoriented by fear and adrenaline, probably a dose of carbon dioxide myself, that I didn't really know what happened. But I do know what happened to me. And I know what happened to Uncle Lee too. I just don't think I'm ready to actually say it. I don't think I'll ever be ready because doing so feels like opening the door to some great and terrible darkness. I just know there's something out there deep in those mine shafts just north of Cucumber. Something that's better off left alone. My name is Mira, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UNC Chapel Hill in the Department of Anthropology. My research focuses on the intersection of cultural practices and social identity with an emphasis on ethnographic methodologies and historical contextualization. In plain English, I study how people's traditions and sense of belonging connect by watching them closely and looking at their past. I've undertaken many interesting projects over the years. Most have been both enriching and satisfying, but there's one I frankly wish I could forget. Not because of the subject matter or the people I dealt with. I can't speak highly enough of either, but rather because of a very particular encounter with a very particular woman while researching the Melungeon Appalachians To cut a very long story short, the Melungeons are a mixed-race people who inhabit the area where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina intersect. They're believed to have a blend of European, African, and Native American ancestries with origins tracing back to the late 18th century or earlier. The term Melungeon comes from the French word mélange, meaning mixture, and was applied to those who lived in relative isolation in areas like Hawkins and Hancock counties in Tennessee, Lee County in Virginia, and parts of western North Carolina. The exact origins of the Melungeons remain hotly debated. Theories range from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or lost colony survivors to unions between free peoples of color, European settlers, and indigenous groups like the Cherokee or Saponi. Genetic studies suggest many Melungeons have roots in sub-Saharan Africa and northern Europe, possibly from early colonial interactions before strict racial laws were established. Physical traits like dark hair, light eyes, and the so-called Melungeon bump on the head have been observed by researchers, though appearances vary widely. Over time, many Melungeons assimilated into broader populations, but these days it's common for their descendants to embrace their ancestry through groups like the Melungeon Heritage Association, who celebrate a complex identity that challenges traditionally rigid racial categories. Undertaking research into the Melungeons seemed like an incredible opportunity. In anthropology, it's rare to get one like that, without a 14-hour flight and a phrase book. I was overjoyed when my proposal was accepted, but if I'd known what I was going to encounter, there's no way in hell I would have honored it. I remember driving along this winding Appalachian road, my old sedan rattling over gravel as I wondered if it would finally give up before I reached my destination. The latest thread I'd pulled led me to a village called Hollow Ridge. Depending on which map you studied, it wasn't even on some of them. Some accounts made the rather incredible claim that the town's population manifested an atypical aging process, one that defied normal physiological expectations. Or to phrase it like the nice lady at the diner I stopped at said, all that good mountain air means folks out there live a heck of a long time. My notebooks were full of dead ends, so I figured there was no harm chasing that one too. After hours of driving, Hollow Ridge finally came into view. Clapboard houses sagged against the hillside. Smoke curled from chimneys. A few folks lingered on porches watching me roll in. I parked near a general store, grabbed my bag, and stepped out to breathe air that smelled of damp earth and pine. A man in overalls nodded at me from across the street. I nodded back and headed inside. The store clerk, a wiry guy with graying hair, eyed me with suspicion when I started asking questions about the village. I told him I was a genealogist tracking Melungeon bloodlines. He frowned, gave me another look of mistrust, then pointed me toward a dirt path leading up the ridge. Folks up there don't take to outsiders, he said. Better mind yourself. I thanked him, bought a Coke and a pack of gum, then started walking toward the ridge. The path climbed steep and cut through thick woods. My boots crunched on leaves and twigs. It was tough going, but after maybe a mile, I came to a cluster of houses, smaller and older than the ones below. A woman sat on a porch shelling peas. She looked up, her eyes dark and steady. I introduced myself and said I was researching family histories. She didn't smile. She just jerked her head toward the house behind her. Mama's inside, she told me. She's the one you want to talk to. I stepped up onto the porch. The door creaked open before I could knock. Two men stood there, both tall with weathered skin and white hair. They looked like brothers. They didn't invite me in. They didn't ask what I wanted. They just stared until I explained why I was there. I kept it simple. The slightly shorter man, who had a scar across his cheek, told me, Mama's 112. She don't talk much. Don't tire her out. The other one nodded. Then they stepped out of the doorway and beckoned me inside. The house smelled of mildew and wood smoke. A dim living room was lit by a single electric lamp in the corner. Lying in a single bed was a woman, or at least what was left of one. When I say she was skeletal, I mean that in the literal sense. Her skin was stretched so tight over her bones that it looked like the slightest touch would draw blood. Her eyes were sunk so deep in their sockets that it made her look ghostly. Her hair hung in thin white strands. Her hands rested like claws by her sides. Her breathing sounded like her windpipe was lined with sandpaper. I'd seen elderly folks before, but she was something else. As I sat down on the stool, one of her sons dragged over. She showed no reaction to me whatsoever. Not a look, not a word, nothing. I started easy by asking her name. When she didn't respond, one of her sons whispered, Onada. I asked where her people came from. No answer. Her gaze remained locked on the near distance, unblinking. I tried asking about her parents, her childhood. Still nothing. Her sons hovered nearby, arms crossed, watching. She's weak, one of them eventually said. Don't push her! I told them I understood, but my curiosity burned in my chest. A 112-year-old who looked like she'd been starving for decades. I had to know more. I leaned forward, keeping my voice soft. "Ma'am," I said, "how long have you lived for? How have you lived so long? What's your secret?" For the first time, she seemed to latch onto a word. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted. She turned to me with a look of fear on her face. Then in a faint, raspy voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It eats the years." The strain of forcing out those words looked like it was killing her. When she was done, her eyes rolled back. Her body jerked weakly as she began to gasp for air. Her sons rushed over. One yelled for me to get out, while the other tended to his mother. I grabbed my bag and stumbled outside, heart hammering as the door slammed behind me. As I walked back down the ridgeline, the old woman's words echoed in my skull. What in the world did she mean by "it eats the years"? I wanted to go back. I wanted to demand answers. But I knew better than to outstay my welcome in such an isolated place. The woman with the peas was gone, her bowl abandoned. I started down the path with the son's cry of "don't come back" still ringing in my ears. When I got back to my car, I sat for a while, scribbling down every detail I could. The village felt different now, quieter, heavier. As I drove off, I found myself checking my rearview mirror much more frequently than usual. That night, I sat in my apartment replaying the day's events over and over. Onata's face wouldn't leave me, neither would her words. I tried to sleep, but the encounter kept replaying in my mind. When I finally did sleep, I had the most vivid nightmare. I was lying in that bed, more than a century old, croaking the words "it eats the years" in the face of some terrified young researcher. The next morning, I called a research fellow I happened to be friends with, a folklorist who'd written whole studies on Appalachian myths and legends. I told him about Hollow Ridge, about Onata and what she'd said. He went quiet for a few seconds. Then, after clearing his throat, he said he'd heard rumors of a village fitting that description. He'd never been able to confirm them because they never came with many details. Just old folk tales about pacts with the land. He told me such a find might end up being a great source of pride for me. He was excited to read my paper when it was finished. I thanked him, but after I hung up, I found myself even more unsettled than before. As the days went by, I found it impossible to think of anything else. Maybe it was the way my friend hyped me up, but I simply had to know more. About a week later, I drove back to that village, parked my car, and walked down that path again. But when I arrived at the village and walked up the ridgeline to where Onata's home had been, no one was on the porches. The houses seemed empty. I reached Onata's family home and knocked on the door. No answer. I found the door unlocked. My curiosity got the better of me and I pushed it open. The living room was empty. No lamp, no bed, no Onata. I checked the other rooms. Nothing. No furniture or signs of life. I walked back outside and called out. I got nothing but silence. It was like everyone had vanished. Weeks went by. I found myself avoiding my research, but the question still gnawed at me. What did Onata mean by "it eats the years"? It couldn't be literal, right? It had to be a metaphor. But for what? And why did it look like it scared her so badly? I began digging into my books, cross-referencing Melungeon, folklore with anything I could find on Hollow Ridge. I had no luck. Then I engaged with the university's archival resources, including those in the North Carolina collection at Wilson Library's Special Collections. That's where I had a small but very significant breakthrough. One night, while deep in online research, I found an old journal scan dated from the 1700s. It detailed a fur trapper's account of what he called Hungry Hollow. The village he described matched Hollow Ridge perfectly. While he didn't provide much detail beyond the description, he stated very clearly that the place's unnatural temperament meant he'd avoid a return visit no matter the cost. If you assumed my encounter with Onata and her two sons failed to make it into my research paper, you'd be correct. I wanted more than anything to get to the bottom of what I'd seen and heard. But with nothing to reference outside of my own personal experience, doing so would have been fruitless at best and detrimental at worst. So instead of falling down a rabbit hole of a rather spurious nature, I decided the best course of action was to try and forget about it. But I can't forget. No matter how hard I try to rationalize what Onata said to me, there's still something deeply unsettling about the way she acted while saying it. I wouldn't say I've spent a lot of time around the elderly or the senile, not as much as other researchers, but I feel capable of distinguishing the confusion and fright of slowly losing one's mind from the very tangible terror associated with things people believe are real. On that day, in Onata's eyes, I saw real emotion and real fear, and I'm in no hurry whatsoever to encounter it again in the near or distant future. Among the shadowy hollows of 19th century rural Tennessee, a series of terrifying occurrences would come to etch themselves into American folklore as some of the most sinister ever recorded. It was a force of malevolence so palpable, so relentless that it claimed a life, drove a family to the brink of madness, and left a legacy of fear that lingers in the air of Robertson County to this day. But the force in question was no mere ghost story whispered around campfires. She was connected to a woman who actually existed. Over time, her deeds and devilry would earn her the nickname, the Bell Witch. This is not a tale of vague apparitions or spurious sightings. This is the account of a presence so vile it defied explanation. A nightmare that clawed its way into reality and refused to let go. The Bell family, consisting of John Sr., his wife Lucy, and their 9 children, had settled into their sprawling farmstead in 1804. They'd since carved out a life of relative comfort amid the beauty of the Tennessee frontier. For more than a decade, their days were marked by the rhythm of toil and harvest, the creak of wagon wheels, and the laughter of their many children. But in the summer of 1817, everything changed. It began with a knock on the cabin walls, sharp and insistent, like knuckles rapping on the other side of the grave. The family dismissed it, claiming the sound was the result of wind on a loose branch, or perhaps a wild animal. But then came the scratches, clawing at the windows as if something begged to be allowed inside. Night after night, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, until the Bells could no longer deny them. John Bell Sr., a hardy, no-nonsense farmer with a stern demeanor, was the first to glimpse their visitor. While walking through his cornfield one sweltering afternoon, he suddenly froze as a grotesque creature seemingly materialized before his eyes. He saw a dog-like beast with the head of a rabbit, its eyes glinting with an unnatural hunger. In an instant, he shouldered and fired his musket. But as the shot echoed across the field, the creature vanished into thin air, leaving only the stench of sulfur and a creeping dread in its wake. That night, the knocking returned, fiercer and angrier than before. As if the beast had followed John home, the children began to see things too. Betsy, John's youngest daughter, wept as she described a girl in a green dress swinging from an oak tree, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. Drury, one of his sons, swore a bird of monstrous size had flown down and perched atop the family barn before, staring at him with eyes that burned like fire. Over time, the disturbances escalated with a ferocity that turned the Bell family cabin into a place of terror. Furniture shook violently. Bed covers were ripped from sleeping bodies by invisible hands. Chains rattled across the floorboards, dragged by no discernible force. The sightings of strange animals continued. Then came the voices. They were mere whispers at first, hissing through the walls, followed by a raspy, guttural tone that seemed to claw its way up from the deepest pit. "I am Kate," they declared. Suddenly things started to make sense to old John Bell. Kate. Batts had been the name of a deceased local woman, rumored to have once cursed him over a land dispute. Yet whether it truly was her spirit or something far older masquerading in her name, no one could say. What was clear was that the spirit spoke, with a clarity that chilled the Bell family's blood, mocking them, revealing their deepest secrets and taunting them with hints of horrors yet to come. Little Betsy Bell, who was just 12 years old at the time, became Kate's favored target. The witch poured her wrath upon her with a cruelty that defies comprehension. Invisible fists pummeled her fragile frame, leaving bruises and welts that bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. Her hair was yanked into knots so tight they drew blood. Her screams were swallowed by the night as the witch's voice cackled in delight. "You'll never know peace," it snarled, pinning her to the bed with a weight no human could lift. The family watched helpless as Betsy's bright spirit withered under the relentless assault. Her eyes grew hollow, her voice reduced to a whimper. The witch denied her any rest. Neighbors flocked to the farm, drawn by tales of the disturbances, only to flee in terror as the witch turned its malice on them. It twisted their insides, causing unimaginable pain. It hurled objects and shrieked curses that echoed through the trees. The witch might have targeted his children for particularly cruel torment, but it was the family's patriarch, John Sr., who bore the brunt of the witch's ultimate vendetta. She vowed to destroy him and pursued her goal with satanic zeal. His health unraveled as the haunting intensified. His tongue swelled inexplicably, choking off his words. His face twitched with spasms that contorted into a mask of agony. His limbs seized as if controlled by some cruel mistress. The witch taunted him endlessly, her voice a venomous hiss in his ears. "I'll take your life, John Bell, and I'll dance on your grave." Eventually, on December 20th of 1820, after 3 years of relentless torment, John Sr.'s body finally failed him. He was found lifeless in his bed, having passed in his sleep. A vial of strange, foul-smelling liquid sat beside him. The family later confirmed it was poison, supposedly fed to him by the witch. The state of Tennessee recorded John's death as the only one officially attributed to a supernatural entity, a grim testament to the power of old Kate Batts and the entity with which she'd compacted. Even Andrew Jackson, the fearless general and future president, proved unable to withstand the Bell Witch's fury. In 1819, he and his men camped on the Bell family farm, eager to confront whatever entity inhabited the place. But as their wagon approached, its wheels locked inexplicably. The air filled with a deafening shriek. "I'd rather face the British Army than spend another night here," Jackson reportedly declared, fleeing before dawn with his troops in tow. If a man of his conviction was left quaking before the witch, what hope did a family of simple farmers have? The witch's reign of terror didn't end with John's death. It lingered, tormenting Betsy and the surviving Bells until 1821, when it abruptly announced its departure. But not without promising to return after 7 years. True to its word, it reappeared in 1828, shaking beds and whispering threats to Lucy and the remaining children, before vanishing again. It vowed another return in 1935, 107 years later. Although no widespread haunting materialized, locals in Adams insist the entity never truly left. Strange lights flicker in the woods, disembodied screams pierce the silence of the night. And the Bell Witch Cave, a limestone hollow near the original farm, still pulsates with an energy that drives visitors to the brink of sanity. Upon visiting the Bell Witch Cave, visitors are greeted by what amounts to a gaping maw. Its jagged walls glisten with slime and damp. The air remains thick with a deeply unsettling stench. Those who brave its depths report footsteps echoing where no one walks, growls rumbling from the shadows, and a suffocating sense of being watched. In 1986, 2 reporters from the Tennessean planned to spend a night inside. Armed with skepticism and flashlights, staff writer David Gerard and staff photographer Bill Wilson lasted mere hours before bolting, driven out by guttural noises that swelled into a roar. A sound no cave should make. It was a short, powerful burst of sound that reverberated from the back of the cave and hit us like a slap, Gerard later wrote. It was not a metallic screech or the howl of wind. It was vocal, loud, high-pitched, a scream. We looked at each other, got through that gate, and quickly left the cave behind us. Logically speaking, we frightened ourselves with our imaginations, Gerard continued. Or someone very much alive and human, frightened us for fun and profit. Those are the reasonable explanations. But on the night in question, with my scalp tingling and my hair rising, our fear seemed reasonable. Common sense. Gerard and Wilson seemed convinced that what they'd encountered was real. But was it actually the Bell Witch? And if so, what exactly is she? Many theories abound. Some call it Kate Bat's vengeful spirit. Others claim it's a poltergeist fueled by Betsy Bell's adolescent turmoil. Yet some believe a demon masquerading as a spirit is to blame. Science offers tepid explanations. Heavy metal poisoning might account for John's symptoms. Mass hysteria seems to explain the rest. Yet such theories fall flat against the hundreds of witnesses, from neighbors to clergy to President Jackson himself, who saw, heard, and felt the Bell Witch's presence. Surely no hoax could sustain such terror for decades, nor would one be capable of leaving such a lasting scar on such a close, knit community. Today the Bell family farm is long gone, but the Witch's Cave remains, a pilgrimage site for thrill seekers and paranormal investigators alike. Every creak of the trees, every unexplained shadow carries the echo of old Kate Bat's mysterious malice. Locals speak of her in hushed tones, wary of invoking her name lest she turn her gaze their way. The Bell Witch is no campfire tale to be shrugged off at dawn. It's a wound in the fabric of reality, a reminder that some evils don't fade. They simply wait for their next victim. And in the stillness of the Tennessee night, when the wind dies and the darkness presses close, you might hear it. A faint knock, a scratch, or a whisper that promises the tale of the Bell Witch is far from over. If the story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let me know how it made you feel. And if there's anything you think could be improved, your suggestions are always welcome. And don't go anywhere because the next stories are even more disturbing. I've hiked the Appalachian trail sections in North Carolina dozens of times. I know these mountains like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. What happened last October changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. It was a Tuesday morning, mid-fall, and the leaves were at their peak. I'd taken the day off work to hit the trail before the weekend crowd showed up. The parking lot at the trailhead was empty except for my Jeep, which was perfect. I like hiking alone. Always have. There's something about the solitude that clears my head in a way nothing else can. The first 3 miles were beautiful. The kind of beautiful that makes you forget about your mortgage and your boss and all the small stresses that pile up during the week. Just me, the rustling leaves, and the occasional bird call. Then around mile 4, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw a guy, maybe in his 30s, wearing a faded red jacket and a hiking pack that looked like it had seen better days. He waved and smiled, and I nodded back. I'm not unfriendly, but I also wasn't looking for company. Still, the trail is for everyone, so I didn't think much of it. But then he caught up to me, started walking alongside me. That's when the conversation began. His name was Marcus, he said. He was from Asheville, worked as a park ranger before he decided to take some time off to really explore the trails he'd been managing for years. We talked about the usual stuff, favorite trails, worst weather we'd been caught in, that kind of thing. He was nice enough, easy to talk to, had this way of asking questions that made you want to keep the conversation going. We hiked together for about 2 hours. He told me about growing up in the mountains, about his dad teaching him to fish in the streams that run through these forests. He mentioned a spot up ahead where the view was supposed to be incredible, a little off the main trail. Said he'd been meaning to check it out. I was game. Like I said, I knew these mountains, but there's always something new to discover. That's when things started feeling off. We took the side trail he mentioned, and after about 15 minutes, I realized I didn't recognize any of the landmarks. The trees looked denser. The light seemed different. I checked my phone for the GPS, but of course, no signal. I'd been stupid to leave the main trail with someone I'd just met. I told Marcus I thought we should head back. He agreed immediately, which made me feel a little better. But as we turned around, I noticed something strange. His boots weren't making any sound on the leaves. I could hear my own footsteps crunching and shuffling, but his were silent, completely silent, completely. I stopped walking. He stopped too, a few feet ahead of me, and turned around. That's when I really looked at his face. His skin was too pale, his eyes too dark, and when he smiled, it didn't reach those eyes at all. I asked him straight out, "Who are you, really?" He tilted his head like he was thinking about how to answer. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said he'd been hiking this trail 5 years ago. Said he'd taken a wrong turn, tried to find his way back, but got lost as the sun went down. Said he fell, hit his head on a rock near a creek. Said he'd been trying to find his way out ever since. I felt my stomach drop. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He kept talking, kept explaining how he didn't realize what had happened at first, how he kept trying to get help from other hikers, but most people couldn't see him or hear him. But sometimes, every once in a while, someone could. Someone like me. He said he wasn't trying to scare me. He just wanted to talk to someone. Said it had been so long since anyone had really seen him. And then he asked me for a favor. He asked me to tell his family where he was. He told me his last name. Told me about a creek about a mile east of where we were standing. Told me that's where I'd find what was left of him. I don't know how long I stood there. Could have been seconds or minutes. But when I blinked, he was gone. Just vanished like he was never there at all. I ran. I ran back the way I thought we'd come. Branches scratching my face. My heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. It took me almost an hour to find the main trail again. When I got back to my Jeep, I sat in the driver's seat shaking for 20 minutes before I could even put the key in the ignition. When I got home, I did something I still can't fully explain. I looked up his last name online with keywords like missing hiker and Appalachian trail, and I found him. Marcus Chen, age 32, reported missing 5 years ago after he didn't return from a solo hike. His family had been searching for him for months. They'd never found a body. I called the number listed on one of the old missing person posters. A woman answered. His sister. I told her everything. Told her about the creek, gave her the exact location as best as I could describe it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she thanked me, her voice barely a whisper. 2 weeks later, I saw a news article. They'd found remains matching Marcus Chen's dental records. Exactly where he said they'd be. Near a creek, off the main trail. He'd fallen and hit his head, just like he told me. The medical examiner estimated he'd been there for about 5 years. I haven't been back to that trail since. I don't think I ever will. Because sometimes when I'm alone at night, I wonder how many others are out there, wandering those mountains, hoping someone will finally see them and help them find their way home. The three of us had been planning this trip for months. Me, Jason, and Tyler had been best friends since high school, and even though life had taken us in different directions after college, we made a point to do at least one adventure together every year. This year it was a 3-day camping trip in the Smokies, specifically around Clingman's Dome and the surrounding backcountry. We started our hike on a Friday afternoon in early September. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and the summer crowds had already thinned out. We planned to camp at a designated backcountry site the first night, then spend the next day exploring some of the more remote areas before heading back on Sunday. That first night was exactly what we'd hoped for. We set up our tents, cooked some food over our camp stove, and stayed up late talking and laughing the way we always did. Jason told his terrible jokes. Tyler complained about his job. I talked about maybe finally asking out the girl who worked at the coffee shop near my apartment. It was perfect. The kind of night that makes you feel like everything is going to be okay, you know? Saturday morning, we woke up early and decided to split up for a few hours. Tyler wanted to check out a waterfall he'd read about that was a couple miles off our route. Jason and I wanted to climb to a ridge overlook we'd seen on the map. We agreed to meet back at camp by 2 in the afternoon, gave ourselves plenty of time before dark. Jason and I got back to camp around 1:30. We were in good spirits, the hike had been beautiful, and we'd taken some great photos. We set up our chairs and waited for Tyler. 2 o'clock came and went. No Tyler. By 3, we started joking that he'd probably gotten distracted taking pictures. Tyler was like that, always stopping to photograph mushrooms or interesting tree bark or whatever caught his eye. By 4 o'clock, we weren't joking anymore. By 5, we were actively worried. We packed up some supplies and headed in the direction Tyler had gone, calling his name, checking our phones even though we knew there was no signal out here. Nothing. No response. No sign of him. When it started getting dark, we made the decision to hike back to the nearest ranger station. It took us almost 3 hours in the dark with our headlamps. When we finally found a ranger, we explained everything. They organized a search party that went out that night. Jason and I went with them, but we didn't find anything. No Tyler, no backpack, no trace of him at all. The search continued through Sunday. They brought in dogs, volunteers, more rangers. They searched the waterfall area. They searched everywhere within a 5-mile radius. Nothing. It was like Tyler had just vanished into thin air. By Monday morning, Jason and I were exhausted and terrified. We'd barely slept. We'd called Tyler's parents, which was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. They drove up from Tennessee and arrived by afternoon. His mom was crying. His dad looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. The search went on. Tuesday morning, they expanded the search area even further, and that's when they found him. A hiker who wasn't even part of the official search party stumbled onto Tyler's body about 7 miles from where he'd said he was going. 7 miles. The rangers couldn't understand it. There was no reason for him to have been that far off course. The waterfall he'd been heading to was in the complete opposite direction. But here's the part that still keeps me up at night. When they examined his body, the medical examiner said he'd been dead for approximately 36 to 48 hours, which meant he died sometime on Saturday, probably Saturday afternoon or evening. Jason and I had been searching for him Saturday night. We'd been calling his name. We'd been less than a few miles away at times during the official search, and he'd been lying there the whole time, already gone, and we didn't know it. They said it looked like he'd fallen, maybe hit his head. There was trauma to the back of his skull. But they couldn't explain why he'd gone so far off his planned route. His camera was found near his body. When they checked the photos, the last ones were of the waterfall he'd intended to visit. Normal pictures. Nothing strange. Nothing that explained what happened after. The thing that haunts me most is the timeline. If he died Saturday afternoon, that was only a few hours after we'd split up. If we hadn't separated, if we'd all stayed together, would he still be alive? Was it quick? Did he suffer? Did he call out for help that nobody heard? His parents asked us to speak at the funeral. I don't remember what I said. I remember standing at the podium looking at the closed casket and thinking about how Tyler should have been there making jokes about how boring funerals are. How he should have been the one helping us get through someone else's loss, not being the loss we had to get through. Jason and I don't talk much anymore. It's not that we're mad at each other. It's that every time we talk, we both think about Tyler. We both think about that Saturday morning when everything was still fine. When we made the decision to split up. When we didn't know it was the last time we'd see our friend alive. I drive past the exit for the Smokies sometimes on my way to visit my parents. I never take it. I can't. Those mountains took my best friend, and I still don't understand why. I still don't understand how a simple day hike turned into a nightmare that we're never going to wake up from. Sometimes I dream that I'm back on that trail calling Tyler's name. And in the dream, he answers. He comes walking out of the trees with that goofy smile of his, asking what all the fuss is about. But then I wake up and remember that he's never going to answer. He's never going to walk out of those trees. And I'm never going to stop wondering what really happened out there in those woods. We'd been living in our cabin outside Boone for about 6 months when it happened. My wife Sarah and I had saved for years to buy a little place in the mountains. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom cabin on 5 acres, far enough from town to feel like we'd escaped the rat race, but close enough that we could get groceries without planning a major expedition. We loved it there. Loved waking up to the sound of birds instead of traffic. Loved sitting on our porch at night watching the stars. We felt safe, isolated in a good way. The kind of isolation that feels like freedom. It was a Thursday night in late November. Cold, but not freezing yet. We'd finished dinner and were watching a movie when we heard the first sound. A crash from the back of the house, like something heavy falling over. I hit pause on the TV and we both sat there listening. Sarah looked at me with wide eyes and whispered that maybe it was a bear getting into our trash. We'd been warned about bears when we moved in. Our nearest neighbor, old Mr. Patterson, who lived about a mile down the road, had told us to keep our garbage locked up tight. But I'd been lazy that week. I'd left a bag of trash on the back porch, planning to take it to the bins in the morning. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, telling Sarah to stay inside. When I opened the back door and shined the light around, I saw that our trash bag had been torn open. Food scraps everywhere, but no bear. The trees were still. Everything was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I realized I couldn't hear any of the usual night sounds. No insects, no rustling, nothing. I went back inside and locked the door. Told Sarah it was probably just a raccoon or something. She nodded, but neither of us really believed it. We went back to our movie, but we weren't really watching anymore. We were listening, waiting. About 20 minutes later, we heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human footsteps on our porch. Heavy boots, multiple sets of them. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard I could feel her nails digging in even through my shirt. I reached for my phone to call 911, but my hand was shaking so bad I almost dropped it. Before I could dial, someone tried the door handle. Just tried it casually, like they were checking if we'd left it unlocked. We hadn't. Thank God we hadn't. Then we heard voices. Men's voices. 3 or 4 of them. They were talking to each other, but I couldn't make out the words. Then the banging started. Someone was pounding on the door, demanding we open it. The voice was rough, aggressive. He said they knew we were in there, said they could see our car outside, said we needed to open the door right now, or things were going to get bad. I was on the phone with 911 by then. The dispatcher was trying to keep me calm, telling me officers were on their way, but I knew it would take at least 20 minutes for anyone to reach us out here. Maybe more. Sarah was crying quietly, trying not to make any sound they could hear. They stopped banging on the front door and everything went quiet again. For about 30 seconds, I thought maybe they'd left. Then we heard the sound of breaking glass from the bedroom. They were coming in through the window. I grabbed Sarah and we ran to our bathroom. It was the only room with a lock on the inside door and no windows. We locked ourselves in and I pushed Sarah into the bathtub, covering her with my body. I could hear them inside our house now. Boots on our floors, things being knocked over, drawers being opened and emptied. They were looking for valuables, cash, jewelry, electronics, anything they could carry. And they were taking their time about it. They weren't rushing. They knew we were there somewhere and they didn't care. Or maybe that made it more fun for them. One of them tried the bathroom door. The handle rattled. Then he kicked it. The door shook but held. He kicked it again and again. On the 4th kick, I heard the wood starting to splinter. Sarah was sobbing into my chest and I was whispering to her that it was going to be okay, that the police were coming, but I didn't believe it. I thought we were going to die in our own bathroom. Then we heard sirens, distant but getting closer. The kicking stopped. We heard shouting and then the sound of running. They were leaving, getting out before the police arrived. The sirens got louder and I heard car doors slamming, engines starting. By the time I got the courage to come out of the bathroom, They were gone. The police found our house completely ransacked. They'd taken our TV, our laptop, Sarah's jewelry box, about $300 in cash we'd kept in a kitchen drawer. They'd gone through everything. Our closets, our drawers. They'd even taken prescription medication from our medicine cabinet. The officers were professional and sympathetic, but they were also realistic. They said this kind of thing had been happening more often in rural areas. Groups of men targeting isolated homes. They took fingerprints but said not to get our hopes up. These guys knew what they were doing. The worst part was they told us we were lucky. Another couple about 30 miles away had been home during a similar break-in 2 months earlier. The husband had confronted the intruders and ended up in the hospital with a fractured skull and broken ribs. His wife had been traumatized so badly she refused to stay in their house anymore. They'd moved in with family in Charlotte and put the house up for sale. Sarah and I left that night. Stayed in a hotel in town. We went back the next day with Mr. Patterson to get some clothes and important documents. But we couldn't stay there. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow looked like someone coming through a window. We put the cabin on the market 2 weeks later and sold it at a loss. We didn't care. We just wanted out. We live in an apartment in Raleigh now. 3rd floor, security cameras, doorman, multiple locks. Sarah still has nightmares sometimes. Wakes up thinking she hears someone breaking in. I've installed extra locks on every door and window, even though we're in a secure building. The therapist says it's going to take time. Sometimes I think about that cabin. About how much we loved it there before everything happened. About how we thought isolation would keep us safe when really it just made us vulnerable. About how those men knew exactly what they were doing, targeting people like us who were far from help. The police never caught them. They robbed 2 more houses in the area before the trail went cold. For all I know, they're still out there, driving around mountain roads, looking for the next isolated cabin with lights on and a car in the driveway. Looking for the next people who made the mistake of thinking that peace and quiet meant safety. We wanted to escape to the mountains. We wanted that simple life away from everything. But we learned the hard way that sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural. Sometimes the monsters are real, and they know exactly where to find you when you're all alone. What I'm about to tell you happened 7 years ago, but I still think about it almost every day. My dad and I had been planning this hike for months. We wanted to finish a section of the Appalachian Trail in northern Pennsylvania that we'd left incomplete the year before. We were both experienced hikers. We'd done plenty of trails together over the years, so this wasn't supposed to be anything we couldn't handle. It was early summer when we set out. The weather was perfect. Warm days, mild nights, everything pointing toward an easy trek. But things went wrong almost immediately. We hadn't even been walking for half an hour when my dad slipped while helping a younger hiker over some rocks. His foot got wedged between 2 boulders and twisted badly. It wasn't a serious injury, but it was obvious he wouldn't be able to continue, especially considering the terrain we were heading into. About halfway down the main trail, there was a fork that led to an old overgrown path. It hadn't been maintained in years and had a reputation for being dangerous. There had been reports of people going missing there. At least 2 had been found dead. With my dad's injury, continuing down that path was out of the question. My first thought was to head back home with him, but he insisted I keep going on my own. I was going through a rough time in my life back then. My parents were worried about my mental health, and my dad knew how much it would mean to me to complete the trail. He pushed so hard that I finally agreed. I figured I'd shorten the distance a bit since I'd be alone, but I was determined to finish the hike. He turned back and I kept moving forward. That first day, I ran into a few other hikers, including an old childhood friend I hadn't seen in years, even though I was still a little shaken by what had happened with my dad. As the day went on, that feeling gave way to a strange sense of peace. Around 5 in the afternoon, I reached the fork. The split between the newer, well-used trail and the old wild one that time had mostly erased. I want to say this clearly. If you're not experienced, you should never leave the main trails. They're there for a reason. Safety, accessibility, and the ability to get help if needed. But I had plenty of experience. And as beautiful as the main trails can be, they're nothing compared to the raw, untamed beauty of the wilder paths. I had been walking down that forgotten trail for about 45 minutes when I started thinking it was time to find a good spot to camp. The area I was in was still too sloped, so I kept going until I found flatter ground. Eventually, I came across what seemed like the perfect spot to set up For the next 2 days and nights, everything was absolutely ideal. Breathtaking views, birds singing, the sound of wind through the trees, nature at its purest. It was only when I started descending the other side of the mountain, heading back toward the main trail, that things began to go wrong. Even though I was on my way down, I knew I still had about 2 days of hiking left before I'd reach the safety of the main path. Halfway through the descent, I came across something that sent a chill through me. A shredded t-shirt stained with what looked like blood. It was hanging from some branches, almost like it had been placed there intentionally to be noticed. It was strange and deeply unsettling. The truth is, if you spend time in the wilderness, you'll eventually cross paths with some weird people. 3 years earlier, I'd been robbed by a man, right in the middle of the Pacific Crest Trail. The only reason I felt even somewhat safe was because I was armed. No one would mess with me easily. Just a year before this incident, a clearly strung-out man had tried to break into my tent. So at this point in my life, I didn't scare easily. I kept walking, and after a little while, I found a new place to set up camp. It was more overgrown than I would have liked, but it had good shade, was flat, and seemed protected. I set up the tent, got myself organized, and before I started cooking, I decided to explore the area a bit. That's when I found something that really made me uneasy. Stretched low between 2 trees, there was a tripwire. It was hard to see, set just at ankle height, but high enough for someone to definitely trip on. I only noticed it because one of the trees had some strange markings on it. When I bent down to look, the sun hit the wire and it shimmered. I cut it right away to avoid any accidents, whether mine or someone else's, and went back to camp. That was without a doubt a trap set on purpose, and right then, something shifted inside me. I didn't just feel uneasy anymore. I was genuinely concerned. That kind of fear almost never hits me out there on the trails. I hadn't strayed far from my camp, so when I came back and saw my tent open, I immediately knew something was wrong. I was absolutely sure I'd closed it. And worse, my phone was gone. Someone had definitely been there. I grabbed my gun and scanned the area. The question that hit me was how. How did I not hear anything? No footsteps, no sound of the zipper. I'd only been a few steps away. I wasn't about to wait around for whoever that was to come back. I tore everything down quickly and kept moving, completely on high alert. Now the tripwire and the missing phone were not coincidences. I hated the idea of walking through the forest at night, especially off-trail. But the thought of staying still terrified me more. I kept going until around midnight when I finally stopped to eat something and listen. To the woods. I was trying to hear any signs. Footsteps, movement, anything. After about 15 minutes of silence, I convinced myself I'd gotten far enough away. Whoever it was must have lost me. I set the tent back up and tried to rest. Not sleep, just take the weight off. But I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I got up and stepped out. That's when I saw the second truly terrifying thing. Right in front of my tent, stretched between 2 trees, was another wire. I was getting breakfast ready when I bent down to check the water and saw it glint in the sunlight again. My stomach dropped. I had pissed in that exact area during the night. I clearly remembered a mossy tree. That meant the wire hadn't been there before. It had been placed while I was sleeping. I followed it with my eyes and saw it was connected to a makeshift pulley tied to a branch leading up to a 5-liter metal container suspended by thin steel cables. The container was full of a strong-smelling chemical liquid. I stayed back, and out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Someone was watching me from the trees. I ran for the tent and saw a figure bolting in the opposite direction. I grabbed my gun and fired. At that point, I didn't care about consequences. Whoever it was clearly meant to harm me. I kept hearing him crash through the branches as he ran off. I quickly packed up whatever I could carry and started making my way down the trail toward the main path, fueled by pure adrenaline. The only thing that gave me some comfort was knowing that whoever it was, they were a coward. They wanted to hurt me, but they didn't want to fight. They were looking to catch me off guard, to strike when I was vulnerable. Still, every survival instinct I had was firing as I made my way down. Every step was cautious, my eyes scanning constantly. I had no idea how many more traps might be waiting. I ended up reaching the main trail earlier than I expected. Soon after, I ran into a family who kindly let me use their phone to call for help. Needless to say, once I told my story, that trail was combed over by authorities. They didn't find any more traps, but they did find my abandoned tent and the metal container, which turned out to be filled with battery acid. It was suspended right over the trail, aimed directly downward. A small nail tied to the wire acted as a trigger. Step on the wire, the nail pops a lever, and the acid dumps straight onto the person underneath. It was homemade but highly effective. The precision, the type of chemical, it chilled me to the bone. That wasn't thrown together by an amateur. It wasn't random. Whoever did that knew exactly what they were doing. And even worse, they knew how to do it without getting caught. I've often wondered how that person hauled acid up into the mountains without being seen. The only explanation that makes any sense is that it was someone who knows those woods like the back of their hand. Someone who's been hunting there for years. Someone who has hidden supply spots stashed through the forest and taps into them whenever it's convenient. And above all, someone who sees hunting humans as a kind of sport. Since then, I've read a ton of similar stories from different trails across the US. I even found out about James Scher, a US Forest Service officer in Utah. In April 2012, he was doing a routine patrol along a popular scenic trail deep in the forest when he found a tripwire stretched between two trees at the entrance of a small deadwood shelter. He followed it and discovered a trap made of rocks and sharpened sticks, ready to fall if the wire was tripped. Another trap was set up at a second entrance to the shelter, a pit lined with sharpened sticks covered by brush and another tight tripwire set right in front of it. It was a dangerous, deadly setup. We all need to be more cautious and more alert out there. There are truly evil, twisted people in this world, and some of them are hiding in the Appalachian wilderness, waiting for their next victim. All right, buckle up because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound absolutely insane. And if I hadn't lived through it myself, I'd probably think it was some campfire story too. But it's real, or at least it felt damn real. I'm not saying I've got all the answers, but I need to get this story off my chest before it eats me alive. Maybe someone out there's heard something similar. Maybe you've been in the Smokies and seen things you couldn't explain. This all happened at the tail end of April 2024, but to really understand why it shook me so bad, you need the backstory, which starts about 6 years earlier. Back in 2017, I joined this kind of scrappy Facebook group for amateur hikers. It was nothing fancy, just a loose collection of guys across the southeast who wanted to hike more but didn't have buddies into it. You'd post a trail, see who wanted in, meet up, and hit the woods. That's how I met Jared, Mark, Spencer, and John. Over time, the 5 of us formed a solid crew. We'd planned 2- and 3-day hikes across Tennessee, the Carolinas, Virginia, anywhere with trees and some elevation. We got close, not just in a we camp together way, but in a share your weird dreams and fight over the last can of chili kind of way. You don't get that often past your 20s. For years, we kept talking about hitting the Great Smoky Mountains. It's like the crown jewel around here, but somehow it just kept slipping through the cracks. Either bad timing, weather, permits, we had all the excuses. But last April, we finally made it happen. We planned a 5-day trek through one of the less traveled sections, the kind of path you don't find on Pinterest lists or beginner blogs. This stretch was remote as hell, primitive shelters spaced far apart, steep inclines, dense forest, the good stuff. We all met up at the trailhead on a crisp Wednesday morning. There was frost on the grass, and our breath fogged up when we talked. Not the typical weather for this time of year, but at higher elevations in the Smokies, you can still get some cold snaps in spring. We parked our cars on this sketchy little gravel road that might as well have been a logging path and started hiking. The first day was stunning. Clear skies, spring buds starting to pop, fresh leaves underfoot. That kind of quiet you only get when you're miles away from anything resembling a town. We reached the first shelter around 6 in the evening just as the sun started bleeding orange. Across the sky, it was one of those classic 3-wall wooden shelters. A little rickety, but it held up. When we rolled in, there was already someone there, which was unexpected but not totally unusual. He looked maybe mid-40s, rough around the edges type with this weather-beaten tan coat, a bushy gray beard, and a backpack that had clearly seen better decades. He said his name was Ray, claimed he was a hunter. When we asked what he was hunting, he kind of smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes and said, "Not sure you'd believe me." We laughed it off. Figured he was just one of those guys who liked the sound of his own mystery. None of the 5 of us really cared about hunting or hearing hunting stories, so we didn't ask. If he wanted to play mysterious, we let him. We cooked our dried dinners, told some old stories, and turned in as the rain started tapping on the roof. Nothing too serious, just a light drizzle, pretty common in that area, and something we were already expecting. I remember that morning clearly, mostly because I'd slept unusually well, all things considered. I wasn't in a bed. I was zipped inside a sleeping bag, half exposed to the woods, sharing a shelter with 5 other guys. Still, I felt rested. That was my first thought when I opened my eyes. But almost immediately I realized someone was already up. Jared wasn't in his bag. I sat up and spotted him outside the shelter, standing completely still, staring at the ground like he was trying to figure something out. He must have felt me watching because he glanced over his shoulder and gave me a subtle wave, like "come look at this." Something in his face told me it wasn't nothing. When I stepped outside and reached the edge of the shelter, I saw it. The ground was a mess of footprints. Dozens of them, all barefoot. They were small, maybe a woman's size or a teenager's, but something wasn't right. The shape was strange. The toes were too long, almost like fingers. There was no sign of a struggle, no skid marks or drag lines. Just those weird, clean prints stamped deep into the wet earth circling our shelter. We ended up waking the others, hoping maybe one of them had sleepwalked or something. As unlikely as it was, part of me still wanted it to be one of us. Anything to make sense of those prints. But no, everyone still had their socks on, clean and dry. Their boots were soaked, still caked with mud from the day before. Except for Ray's. His boots were bone dry. That alone would have been strange enough. But the way he acted made it worse. While the rest of us stood there trying to process what we were seeing, Ray barely reacted. It was like he'd expected it. He looked down at the prints for a moment, then calmly started packing his gear. He told us he'd be continuing the trail on his own. We asked if he knew what had made those tracks, and by the way he answered, it was obvious he did. He said that was the reason he'd come out there in the first place. Someone asked if it was some kind of animal, and he just shrugged it off. Then he mentioned something about those mountains being older than we realized. Then he slung his pack over his shoulder and walked off in the direction of the prints. The rest of us just stood there staring at each other, trying to make sense of what the hell had just happened. We figured it was best to keep moving too, but in the opposite direction of the footprints and of Ray. No one said it out loud, but we all felt the same. We spent most of the day tossing around theories, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some weird locals messing around. And yeah, we even brought up the old legends, stories we'd heard growing up about strange things living out in these mountains. By the time the sun started going down, we were exhausted mentally and physically. We just wanted to forget the whole thing. We told ourselves we were far enough away now, that whatever it was, it wouldn't happen again. And even though some of us talked about heading back early, we convinced ourselves it was probably a prank and decided to stick to the plan, at least for one more night. But obviously we were wrong, and the story didn't end there. New shelter, same freaking thing. It had rained lightly, and in the morning, there they were. More of those bizarre barefoot prints. This time there were more, a lot more. We counted nearly 11 distinct prints, maybe more. Like whoever or whatever was out there had been pacing around us all night long. That was the moment it really sank in for all of us. Something wasn't right out there. And whatever it was, it had been close. Too close. I've always been a heavy sleeper, the kind of guy who could sleep through a storm. But Mark wakes up if a branch shifts in the wind. He kept going on about how there was no way something or someone could have been circling us without making a sound. Not a single snap, not a crunch. Even on soft ground, you'd expect a noise, but it was like they floated. 5 grown men dead, asleep while those prints were being laid down just feet from where we slept. It didn't add up. None of it did. By the 4th night, nerves were frayed. We were physically exhausted, emotionally wrecked, and the weather turned nasty. Cold, relentless rain hammered the forest. The final shelter was more run down than the rest, like no one had used it in years. We huddled inside, barely talking. Something had changed. The woods felt aware. That's the only word I've got for it. That night, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. So even though we were sleeping in a shelter, we rigged up a tarp over the entrance to block the wind and rain. We also agreed not to all sleep at once, just in case. We took shifts. I was on watch around 4:30 in the morning, sitting there in the dark, gun in hand, mostly just listening to the storm batter the trees. And then I saw movement. I was looking through a small gap we'd left near the tarp, barely wide enough to notice unless you knew it was there. And through that sliver, I saw them. They stepped out from the tree line like a hallucination. 7 figures. Human-like, but wrong. Too small. Not like little people, but like adults who never fully developed. Every part of them seemed off. Frail, undergrown, almost fragile. They were completely naked and somehow unfazed by the cold. Just walking slowly, silently, circling the shelter like they were studying it. I was frozen, gun in hand, but completely locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was clearly terrified, but weirdly fascinated too. What the hell was I looking at? I reached over and tapped Mark's leg. He woke up like he'd been trained for it. I motioned for silence and shifted so he could take my spot and see for himself. But as he moved, the plastic on his sleeping bag made the tiniest noise. And that was enough. The figures bolted, darted back into the forest like animals. By the time he got a clear look, all he caught was their backs disappearing into the dark. They moved impossibly fast and quiet, like the forest swallowed them whole. We sat there in silence, the kind that feels thick and full of questions. I could feel his body tense next to mine, like the fear had seeped into his muscles. When he finally whispered, he just asked what the hell that was. I didn't have an answer. I was just relieved he saw them too, because if he hadn't, I would have spent the rest of my life trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. They were moving in these smooth, floating circles, not like they were sneaking, but like they had all the time in the world. Their limbs were too long, knees bending a little wrong, and they made no sound. The ground was soggy mud and they were barefoot, but not a single squish or squelch. It was like they were weightless. Eventually we woke the others to tell them what had just happened. Honestly, both of us felt ridiculous saying it out loud, but no one questioned it. No one laughed or pushed back. I think deep down they all already knew something was out there. And now 2 of us had seen it with our own eyes. At least now we could put a shape to those footprints. I don't know if that made it better or worse. Even though they didn't seem dangerous and hadn't done anything to us. In fact, they'd run the moment they heard a noise. We still decided it was time to get out of those mountains. We couldn't make sense of what we'd seen. Truth is, none of us had ever heard stories about feral people in the Smokies. Sure, we'd heard rumors from other parts of the Appalachian Trail, but never in this area. In fact, we didn't even know if they were people. Yeah, they looked more like people than any other animal, but at the same time, their bodies were just bizarre. We filed a report with the rangers when we got back, told them everything. One of them took notes, nodded slowly, and when we pushed him for answers, he just smiled and said, "Lot of stories up in those woods. Most of them don't lead anywhere." But it wasn't the kind of smile that says he doesn't believe you. It was the kind that says he's heard this before, maybe too many times. And now I can't stop wondering about Ray. That dude knew. I'm convinced of it. He came out there to hunt, but didn't say what. I don't think he was out there for deer or bear. I think he was after those things. And the truth is that thought really saddens me. Despite everything, those things weren't dangerous. They didn't try to interact with us. They didn't try to hurt us. What scares me is how people can't seem to handle the unknown without feeling the need to destroy it. The Appalachian Mountains are full of mysteries, and maybe some of them are better left alone. I need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me for 2 weeks now. Even though I've been through plenty of bad things in my life, I never imagined this experience would turn out to be one of the scariest and most haunting moments I've ever lived through. I didn't have a happy childhood. There was never really room for any real sense of happiness. I grew up in a house where violence was a daily thing, with a father who was brutal, unpredictable, and consumed by a kind of rage that seemed endless. My mother, even though her heart was in the right place and she did everything she could, was never really able to stand up to his outbursts. She ended up living constantly caught between fear and despair. Still, the only times my mom ever seemed to find this almost superhuman inner strength was when he threatened to take his anger out on me. Those were the moments she stepped in, even if it cost her. And for that, no matter what, I'll always be grateful to her. That said, my childhood was miserable, filled with constant instability and an almost total lack of affection or safety. When I was 17, my mom passed away. And that loss, besides being absolutely devastating, also became a kind of forced awakening. Maybe because I had nothing left to lose, or maybe because I finally realized I couldn't stay in that environment anymore. So as soon as I turned 18, I built up the courage, stood up to my father, and left that house behind. Leaving wasn't just a step forward. It was a kind of indescribable relief. It's been 12 years since then. And even though there are still moments when the past feels like an anchor dragging me down, I can honestly say I know who I am now. And little by little, I've been rebuilding what was broken inside me. I never had many opportunities. When I left home, I ended up living on the streets, which, ironic as it sounds, wasn't even the lowest point of my life. I was lucky enough to cross paths with a volunteer who believed in me for no apparent reason and who, with incredible generosity, helped me regain my strength, find some direction, and even gave me an old van that, while in desperate need of repairs, gave me a real shot at starting over. Since then, I've managed to build a more stable life. I found work, and even though the van's not new, with all the repairs I've done over the years, it's become almost an extension of me. Sure, I could afford a new one now, but this van means something deeper than just transportation. It represents hope. It marks the moment a complete stranger took a chance on me. Without knowing a thing about me, it reminds me there are still good people out there. Whenever I can take some time off, I like to travel through the mountains. It feels like my safe space, a refuge where I can breathe and be alone with myself. So 2 weeks ago, when I managed to get 14 days off, I decided it was finally time to explore a part of the Appalachian Mountains. I don't even live that far, but I'd never had the chance before. The thought of wandering through those remote, majestic landscapes genuinely excited me. Traveling through the mountains in an old van isn't easy, but I'm used to it. I know the sounds the van makes. I know its limits, and I was confident everything would go smoothly. The first few days were peaceful, though a few strange things happened. One night around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound coming from the mountains that felt off. I can't even describe it properly. It was somewhere between a distant wail and a muffled metallic noise. I ended up brushing it off and going back to sleep, convincing myself it was just an animal. But everything changed on the third night. I was in West Virginia, one of the spots I'd most wanted to visit. When I found a good place to park the van, a dirt back road near a small creek, I didn't hesitate. The plan was to stay 2 or 3 nights and maybe do a few short hikes. But things started going wrong that very first night. I had just finished dinner and was already lying inside the van. Everything cleaned up, watching YouTube videos on my phone when I heard a car pass by. It caught my attention because along with the sound of the engine, there was this strange constant whistling noise, like a mechanical issue. Maybe the exhaust or the brakes. What really got to me, though, was how slowly the car was moving. That's unusual in an area like that, where the few people who drive around usually just speed through, since there's no traffic or people, just the occasional animal crossing the road. I ignored the sound and went back to my video. But less than 2 minutes later, I heard the same car again. This time, clearly turning onto the dirt road where I was parked. That's when I started to feel a bit uneasy. In urban areas, it's normal to share space with other vans or cars. But out in the woods, where there are so many other places to stop, it's more than a little suspicious for someone to choose the exact same spot. I considered that maybe the person didn't see me parked there, or maybe felt safer near someone else. But honestly, that felt like a lame excuse to avoid facing the growing discomfort I was feeling. Even with the curtain shut, the headlights lit up parts of the van's interior. I waited for them to turn off the engine and lights, but nothing happened. I stayed completely still and quiet as the minutes dragged on. Finally, the headlights went out. I heard one door open and close, then footsteps, then another door, and more footsteps. That's when I realized there was more than one person, and they were getting closer to the van. Panic started to creep in. I've had people mess with the van or try the doors before, but always in the city, never somewhere this isolated. One of them turned on a flashlight and tried to look inside. In that moment, I thought about yelling, about threatening that I had a weapon, but the truth is I had nothing. And I'd heard too many stories from other people who live in vans, saying the best move is to pretend nobody's inside. Then I heard something that froze my blood and made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years. A sharp pop, a bang, and I realized they were slashing the van's tires. Whatever chance I had of escaping was gone in that instant. And if I still had any doubts about their intentions, those doubts vanished. They were there to hurt someone, and now they knew I couldn't start the van. That's when I heard another vehicle approaching from the distance. The distinct sound of tires crunching over gravel. And in that moment, my fear turned into pure instinct. I heard the men move away from the van, apparently going to meet the new vehicle. I got up, grabbed the knife I always carry with me, and slid into the driver's seat. I opened the door as quietly as possible and stepped out. I was in a position where I couldn't see them, and hopefully they couldn't see me either. I jumped down a rock ledge and made my way to the creek, hiding in the thick brush. I was almost sure they'd heard me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. And even with the noise of the car and the voices, I felt completely exposed. I crawled away as quietly as I could, but I kept the van in sight. The second car stopped and at least 2 more men got out. 4 total. I watched them move toward the van. 2 had baseball bats, 1 had a knife, and the other held something I couldn't identify. They circled the van, which confirmed they still thought I was inside. A small relief. But it also meant that sooner or later they'd figure out I wasn't and might start looking for tracks or searching the area. I kept moving, trying to stay quiet but not losing pace. When I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering, I started running. I ran like I never had before. I stopped only long enough to catch my breath and kept going. I don't know how many hours passed in that cycle of panic, escape, and exhaustion. I know I spent the whole night out there. The sun was already up and I still had no idea where I was. Just a knife in my hand and my phone left behind in the van. I was thirstier than I'd ever been. Extreme stress completely dries out your mouth. It wasn't until around 11 in the morning that I heard a car in the distance and realized I must be near a road. I stayed hidden, afraid those men might still be out looking for me or someone else. It was only when I heard the distinct sound of a truck that I finally worked up the courage to step out of the bushes and ask for help. The trucker was surprisingly understanding and told me that something almost identical had happened in that same area about 15 years ago, and that shook me to my core. 15 years. Were these the same people, or were there other groups out there doing the same kind of twisted thing and getting away with it? The police confirmed that there had been several similar incidents reported in that region over the years. They took me back to the spot where I'd left the van, and the sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. It was completely trashed, vandalized inside and out, totally unrecognizable. Since then, I've been staying at a coworker's place, and honestly, I think my days of living in a van are over. Maybe it's time to rent a place of my own, to accept that as much as that life once saved me, it's not safe anymore, and maybe it never really was. Not in those mountains. Not in Appalachia where people vanish and nobody asks the right questions. My wife Claire and I have always loved hiking. Before our daughter was born, we spent every free weekend we had out on the trails. We'd done several sections of the Appalachian Mountains together. North Carolina, West Virginia, parts of Tennessee. It was our thing. Our way of disconnecting from everything and just being together in the wild. But when Leah was born, all of that stopped. The first year of her life was a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry. Every cry felt urgent. Every fever felt catastrophic. We were exhausted in ways we'd never experienced before. But we loved her more than anything. After her first birthday, we finally felt like we could breathe again. Leah was stronger. We were getting more sleep, and we were desperate to get back to the mountains. We missed that feeling of being completely alone in nature, far from crowds and noise and the constant hum of daily life. We decided on the Roan Highlands. It's remote, beautiful, not as heavily trafficked as some of the more popular trails. We planned for a week of hiking and camping, just the three of us. We knew it would be challenging with a toddler, but we were confident we could handle it. We'd been to that part of the country before. We knew about the folklore, the stories people tell about those mountains. We'd even had a few strange experiences ourselves over the years, but nothing that ever felt truly dangerous. Nothing we couldn't explain away. Looking back now, I think what happened to us could have happened anywhere, even in the middle of a city. But the isolation of those mountains makes it so much worse, because when something goes wrong out there, you're on your own. The first couple of days were perfect. The weather was good. Leah was happy. We crossed paths with a few other hikers, and everyone was friendly. Just the usual quick hellos and nods as people passed by. But then we met them. It was late afternoon on the second day. We were taking a break near a stream when they walked up. A man and a woman. The woman had curly red hair and wore a dirty straw hat. The man was tall and thin, with a scruffy beard and eyes that seemed too alert, like he was watching everything at once. They started asking us questions. At first it seemed normal enough. How long had we been out here? Where were we headed? But then the questions got more specific. They asked about Leah, if she slept okay in the tent, if we were worried about wild animals, if she was eating well. The woman reached out like she wanted to hold her. Claire instinctively stepped back. She smiled and made some polite excuse, but she didn't hand Leah over. There was something off about the whole interaction. Nothing I could point to exactly, just a feeling, a tension in the air that made my skin prickle. Claire felt it too. After they walked away, we whispered to each other about how strange they were, but we tried to brush it off. Maybe they were just awkward. Maybe we were being paranoid. On the third night, we set up camp in a small clearing about 500 meters off the main trail. It was hidden among tall trees and covered in soft moss that absorbed every sound. It felt private, peaceful. We hung our food from a branch to keep it away from bears and settled in for the night. We both slept hard, better than we had in months. But when we stepped out of the tent in the morning, everything felt wrong. The ground was covered in footprints. Human ones. Not just one or two, several, like multiple people, had walked around our campsite during the night. And then we noticed something else. Leah's things were gone. Her bottle, her small plate and utensils, her sippy cup, all of it. The food we'd hung in the tree was untouched, but her personal items had been taken. Claire went pale. Her hands started shaking. She said she was sure it was them, that couple we'd met. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there had to be another explanation. But I couldn't, because deep down I knew she was right. An animal hadn't taken those things. Someone had walked around our tent while we slept. Someone had looked inside. Someone had been close to our daughter. We made the decision immediately. We were going back. We were still 3 days from the car, but we came up with a plan to make it in 2, even if it meant pushing ourselves to exhaustion. But that meant one more night in the woods, and that thought filled me with dread. We decided to take shifts. One of us would stay awake while the other rested. Claire insisted on going first. She's always had trouble falling asleep early, especially when she's anxious. I lay down with Leah and tried to get some rest, even though my mind was racing. I woke up earlier than I planned. Claire was standing at the entrance of the tent, shaking. She said she'd heard footsteps, that someone was out there, standing just beyond the light of our fire. She handed me the gun. We don't usually bring a gun on trips like this, but we'd started carrying one after a close encounter with a bear a few years back. I always hoped we'd never have to use it, but that night, I was glad we had it. I stepped out of the tent and yelled into the darkness. I said I was armed, that I would protect my family, that they needed to leave. The only response was silence. I stood there for 2 hours, scanning the trees, listening for any sound. My eyes burned from staring into the dark. My hands were cramping from gripping the gun so tight. And then, without meaning to, I fell asleep. I don't know how long I was out. Maybe an hour, maybe less. I woke to Claire screaming. The woman was standing over me, pointing my own gun at my face. The man was halfway inside the tent, reaching for Leah. Everything happened so fast. I grabbed a handful of ash from the fire and threw it at her. She screamed and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide. I lunged forward and knocked the gun out of her hand, hitting her hard in the nose. The man scrambled out of the tent, his eyes wide with panic. I picked up the gun and pointed it at him. I told him he had 5 seconds to get out of there. My voice didn't even sound like my own. It was cold, flat, I meant every word. He backed away, stumbling over his own feet. Then he grabbed the woman and they ran. We thought about packing up and leaving right then, but it was pitch black. We were deep in the woods with no light and a terrified toddler. We decided it was safer to wait until morning. Neither of us slept. We sat together in the tent, holding Leah between us, listening to every sound outside. Every snap of a branch felt like a threat. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. When the sun finally came up, we moved. We didn't stop to eat. We barely stopped to rest. Leah cried for most of the hike, and Claire and I were running on pure adrenaline. But we didn't slow down. We made it back to the car by late afternoon. Then we drove straight to the nearest police station and filed a report. We gave them everything. Detailed descriptions. The exact location where we'd camped. The dates, everything. But they never found them. The case was closed a few weeks later due to lack of evidence. For a long time, I tried to move on. We both did. We told ourselves we were lucky, that it could have been so much worse. And it could have. I know that, but it didn't feel like we'd escaped. It felt like something had been taken from us. That sense of safety, that trust in the world. The belief that if you follow the rules and stay aware and do everything right, you'll be okay, because we did everything right. And it still almost wasn't enough. A few weeks ago, we got a call from the police. They said the case had been reopened. Another couple had reported a similar incident on a different section of the same trail. The descriptions matched. The same man, the same woman. Hearing that should have brought some kind of closure. Some validation that we weren't crazy, that it really happened. But instead, it made everything worse. Because it means they're still out there, still doing this. And we have no idea how many other people they've targeted. How many other families they've watched in the night. Claire doesn't hike anymore. She won't even go for walks in the park near our house if it's too secluded. Leah is 4 now, and she doesn't remember any of it. But Claire does, and so do I. I still think about that night constantly. The look in the woman's eyes when she pointed the gun at me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something empty. Like there was nothing human left inside her. And I think about how close they got to Leah. How easily they could have taken her while we slept. How one mistake, one moment of letting our guard down, almost cost us everything. The forest used to be our refuge. The place where we felt most alive. Most connected. But now it's just a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. How easily the world can turn dark. People always say you should trust your instincts. That if something feels off, it probably is. And they're right. We felt it the moment we met that couple. That uncomfortable tension. That voice in the back of your head telling you something isn't right. But we didn't leave. We stayed. We convinced ourselves we were being paranoid. That we were overreacting. And that's the part that haunts me most. Not what they did, but the fact that we knew. Somewhere deep down we knew. And we ignored it. I don't know if we'll ever go back to those mountains. Part of me wants to. Part of me wants to reclaim that piece of ourselves we lost. But another part of me knows that some things can't be undone. Some scars don't heal. The wilderness doesn't care how prepared you are. It doesn't care how experienced you think you are or how many trails you've hiked before. It's indifferent. And the people who hide in it, the ones who wait and watch and prey on families like ours, they know that. They know that out there, in the silence and the isolation, they have the advantage. And no amount of preparation can protect you from that. We were lucky. I know we were, but luck shouldn't be what keeps you safe. And the fact that it came down to luck, to a handful of ash and a badly aimed shot, is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Claire says she doesn't want to talk about it anymore. She says rehashing it over and over won't change anything. And she's right, but I can't stop, because every time I close my eyes, I see that woman's face. I hear Claire screaming. I feel the weight of the gun in my hand and the absolute terror of not knowing if I'd be fast enough. The mountains are still out there, beautiful, quiet, waiting, and somewhere in them, so are they. I've always had a thing for old fire towers. Maybe it runs in the family. My grandfather spent years working as a lookout ranger, stationed in remote towers across different mountain ranges. Growing up, I'd listen to his stories for hours. Long nights alone in the tower, watching over endless stretches of forest, scanning the horizon for the first sign of smoke. It sounded like the most peaceful job in the world. I wanted to follow in his footsteps. For a long time, that was the plan. But life took me in a different direction. I ended up in a career that had nothing to do with ranger stations or mountain trails. Still, I never lost my love for hiking or for those towers, where my grandfather once stood watch. Whenever I get the chance, I head out to the woods and try to stay in one of the old lookouts. Some are occupied when I arrive. Others are locked up tight, but I always try. Rich Mountain Fire Tower was at the top of my list. It sits right on the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, just outside Hot Springs. My grandfather worked there for a while back in the day, and I'd been meaning to visit for years. He died 3 years ago. No one in the family wanted most of his things, so I ended up with boxes of his old belongings. I couldn't bring myself to go through them for a long time. It hurt too much. But about a year and a half ago, I finally opened them up. Inside one of the boxes were his journals. Pages and pages of careful handwriting, documenting his time at different stations. Most of it was pretty routine. Weather notes, wildlife sightings, the occasional interesting visitor. But then I found the entries from Rich Mountain, and everything changed. The writing was different, messy, almost frantic. He wrote about sleepless nights and the constant feeling of being watched. He described hearing footsteps on the metal stairs in the middle of the night, always stopping just before they reached the top. He wrote about being afraid of what might be hiding under the bed. This was a man who spent weeks at a time, alone in the wilderness without batting an eye. And yet something at Rich Mountain had rattled him badly. After 6 weeks, he was transferred to another post. The entries went back to normal after that. He never mentioned Rich Mountain to me, not once. I had to know what happened up there, so I planned a trip. I wanted to stay at the tower for a few nights and see if I could find any answers. The hike up was exactly what I expected. Steep in places, but manageable. The trail is about 5 miles round trip, and it took me a few hours to reach the tower. I passed a handful of other hikers on the way up, but the tower itself was empty when I arrived. I climbed the stairs, pushed open the hatch, and stepped inside. It was perfect, quiet, untouched. I set my pack down and started getting settled for the night. The first night was mostly calm. I woke up once around 3 in the morning to a sharp metallic sound, like something had hit the stairs. I sat up and listened. Nothing, just silence. I eventually went back to sleep, but it stuck with me. The second day was uneventful. I hiked a bit farther up the mountain, took some notes, and tried to enjoy the solitude. There's something special about being alone in the high country. No phones, no noise, just the wind and the trees and the slow creak of the tower, settling as the sun went down. I cooked dinner on my camp stove, read a few more of my grandfather's entries, and watched the light fade from the catwalk. But I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. That sound. I told myself it was nothing. A pine cone, a branch, something perfectly normal. But when darkness fell, I felt uneasy. I double-checked the hatch, kept my headlamp close, and pulled my sleeping bag tight around me. Around 1:30 in the morning, I heard it again. Not the same metallic sound. This was different. Movement, slow and deliberate. Something was below me. I sat up, heart pounding. I turned off my headlamp and listened. The sound stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. Eventually, I must have drifted off. When I woke, it was dawn. Everything looked normal. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me because of the journals. I spent most of the day exploring the area around the tower. I looked for signs of other people, tracks, old campsites, anything, but there was nothing. That night, I left my boots just outside the hatch. They were caked in mud from the rain earlier in the day, and I didn't want to track the mess inside. After I shut the hatch and locked it, I climbed into my sleeping bag and tried not to think about what my grandfather had written. One sentence kept running through my mind. If it comes again tonight, I don't think I'll make it until morning. I must have fallen asleep sometime after midnight. When I woke, the hatch was open. Not all the way, just a crack, just enough to let in cold air. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust, but when they did, I saw it. Hanging from the ceiling outside the hatch was a figure, completely black, shaped like a person, but I couldn't make out any details. Just a silhouette. I jumped to my feet. The figure vanished. No sound, no footsteps, nothing. Then I realized my boots were gone. I stood there frozen. The hatch had been latched from the inside. No animal could have opened it and taken my boots without making a sound, and the wind wasn't strong enough to lift it. I pulled the hatch shut and locked it again. Then I sat on the bed until morning, gripping my pocket knife like it could actually protect me from whatever that was. At first light, I climbed down barefoot. The metal stairs were freezing. I looked around the clearing for my boots, but they were gone. No tracks, no sign of anything. I packed my gear and left. I didn't stop hiking until I reached the parking lot. Then I drove until I found a motel and collapsed. I've never told anyone this story. Not my partner, not my friends, not my mother, who still asks if I've found anything else in my grandfather's boxes. I've searched online for anyone else who might have experienced something similar at Rich Mountain, forums, Reddit, old trail reports. I found nothing, not a single mention. So either people are keeping quiet like I have, or I imagined the whole thing. But I don't think I did, and I don't think my grandfather imagined it either. It's been decades since he was stationed there. It makes no sense that whatever haunted him could still be around. But I can't shake the feeling that it is. That it's still up there, waiting in that tower. And that doubt is worse than any answer I could have found. I grew up in Swords Creek, a tiny place tucked away in Russell County, down in the far southwestern corner of Virginia. The Appalachian Mountains stretch out in every direction here. And if you're born in a place like this, certain lessons get passed down early. Things you learn without anyone spelling them out. Rules about the forest, about what to respect and what to leave alone. My family has always lived close to the woods. Our house sits a little distance from the others, surrounded by trees that seem to go on forever. As a kid, I spent most of my time out there with my grandfather. He knew those trails better than anyone. He taught me how to read the land, how to move through it quietly, and most importantly, how to treat it with respect. He used to say we don't need to understand everything that happens out there. We just need to respect it. And if we do, it'll respect us back. That idea always settled something in me, made me feel safe. Even when I was deep in the woods and the light was fading, I never messed around with those rules. I wasn't reckless. I didn't go wandering after dark or call out into the trees like some kind of dare. I kept my distance from things I couldn't explain. And for the most part, life went on without incident. But everything changed last spring. One of my closest friends, Reggie, died in an accident. It hit hard. He and I and another guy, James, had been tight since we were kids. Losing him felt like losing a part of myself. Even now, a year later, it still doesn't feel real. A couple weeks ago marked the 1-year anniversary of his death. James and I decided to get together and have a few drinks in his memory. It was supposed to be something simple, just the two of us, remembering the good times. But the grief was heavier than we expected. We drank more than we should have. The night got blurry around the edges. We were sitting out on my back patio when my cats started making noise. They're outdoor cats, but they don't usually come up to the windows after dark. That night, they were yowling like something had spooked them. I went inside to check, and they seemed fine, just rattled. I went back out and sat with James. It was late when we finally decided to call it. James was pretty drunk, and I didn't want him walking home alone. He only lived about 7 minutes away, but still. I couldn't shake the thought of something happening to him. I'd already lost one brother. I wasn't about to lose another, so I broke my own rule. I walked him through the woods after dark. Getting him home was fine. No problems. But on the way back, something shifted. The woods got quiet in a way that didn't feel natural, like everything was holding its breath. And then, just as my house came into view, I heard it. My name, spoken softly from the trees. It was Reggie's voice. I stopped. My chest tightened. I knew better. I really did. But grief does strange things to your judgment. I turned toward the sound and started walking back into the woods. I was almost at the tree line when something snapped me out of it. A sudden sharp clarity. That wasn't Reggie. It couldn't be. I'd been at his funeral. I'd seen him in the casket. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was inside the house with every door and window locked. My cats were pacing the living room, tense and alert. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The alcohol, the grief, my mind playing tricks. But the nights that followed felt different. Heavier, like something was watching. My cats stopped going outside entirely. They wouldn't even go near the windows after sunset. I finally told James I needed to talk to him. I texted him, asked if he could come by. He said he'd stop at home to change after work and then head over. I decided to take a quick shower while I waited. I'd just gotten in when I heard someone knocking at the back door. I figured James had come straight over after all. I opened the bathroom window, which faces the back of the house, and yelled for him to use the spare key. I rushed through the shower and got dressed. But when I stepped out, the air felt wrong, cold, like the door had been left open. I called his name, no answer. I went downstairs. The front door was wide open, but James wasn't there. I grabbed my phone. There was a message from him sent just a few minutes earlier. He'd gotten held up at work. He wouldn't be able to come until after 9:30. My stomach dropped. The door had been locked. Someone had opened it. I slammed it shut and locked it again. Then I went through the house, checking every room. Nothing. No signs of anyone. Just my cats crouched behind the couch, frozen like they'd seen something I couldn't. Since that night, I haven't felt safe in my own home. Something is out there. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I know it's watching. And I know I made a mistake. My grandfather always said the woods would respect you if you respected them. But I broke the rules. I went out after dark. I answered when something called my name. And now I'm living with the consequences. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if this thing will get tired of watching and try something else. All I know is that for the first time in my life, I'm genuinely afraid. Not of the dark, not of being alone, but of whatever is out there in those trees, waiting for me to slip up again. Because now I understand what my grandfather meant when he said respect was the only thing keeping us safe. And I'm not sure I have that protection anymore. If the story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let me know how it made you feel. And if there's anything you think could be improved, your suggestions are always welcome. And don't go anywhere because the next stories are even more disturbing. My grandfather, Thomas Brennan, was a man of faith. As a teenager, he enlisted with the army and found himself in the trenches of France during the First World War, fighting hand-to-hand against enemy soldiers in a landscape he'd never imagined existed. He left home as a boy but came back changed, hardened by what he'd witnessed. After returning, he joined law enforcement in Madison County, deep in the North Carolina mountains, where he served for over 3 decades. Grandpa Tom used to say he'd seen humanity at its absolute worst during the war, witnessed depravity in the mud, and chaos of battle. He told me once that evil wasn't just an abstract concept, but something real, something you could almost see taking root in men's souls. He believed every person carried seeds of both good and evil within them, planted there by forces beyond our control. But he also believed we had a choice. We could nurture the good or feed the darkness. That's why he attended church faithfully, trying to cultivate goodness in his heart and make sense of the cruelty he'd seen people inflict on one another. Sometimes he'd stay for the regular service and head home. Other times he'd remain for hours, sitting alone in those wooden pews with his eyes shut tight and hands folded, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. I remember staying at his place one weekend when I was about 14 or 15. My parents were going through a rough patch. Grandpa Tom had been sharing stories from his law enforcement days. Some funny, some heartbreaking. That's when I asked him about the strangest or most disturbing cases he'd worked. Being family, I suppose he didn't see any reason to sugarcoat things. What he told me next left me absolutely stunned. It was late October 1924. Grandpa Tom went to sleep that Sunday evening feeling content. The week had been peaceful, the autumn weather pleasant, and his new bride had prepared a magnificent Sunday supper. As he drifted off, everything seemed right with the world. But when he woke the next morning, he found himself in the midst of a nightmare. Grandpa rose at dawn, cleaned up, ate breakfast, and drove his department-issued Ford to the sheriff's office in town, arriving promptly at 7. He'd just settled behind the front desk with his second cup of coffee when a disheveled man stumbled through the door. The man had walked miles along the highway in just his socks. Grandpa could tell immediately the man was intoxicated, his eyes bloodshot and wild, filled with a terror that went beyond simple drunkenness. The stranger lurched to the desk and begged to be locked up. When asked why, he became frantic, insisting he needed to be imprisoned or shot because he'd just killed his wife and baby girl. My grandfather didn't recognize this man, and drunk people say all sorts of nonsense. But something about his demeanor suggested he was telling the truth. So without handcuffs or even locking the main door, Grandpa Tom led him to a cell and immediately called the sheriff to report what he'd heard. Hours later, Grandpa joined the sheriff and several deputies on the drive out to verify the man's confession. Despite being extremely intoxicated when he'd turned himself in, the man hadn't lied. He'd butchered his wife and infant daughter with a hatchet while they slept together. The weapon lay nearby on the floor. Grandpa said the scene was so horrific you couldn't distinguish where the mother ended and the child began. Back at the station, after the man had sobered up somewhat, they asked him why he'd done it. Hungover and exhausted from being awake over 24 hours, he wasn't entirely coherent. But what he said captured my grandfather's complete attention. About 2 months before the murders, the man, whose name was Leonard Mills, was walking home from his job at the lumber mill when he encountered a woman by the roadside. She introduced herself as Rose, and Leonard thought she was the most stunning woman he'd ever laid eyes on. That first day, they simply exchanged smiles as they passed. But the next day, they spoke. And the day after that. And the day after that. By week's end, Leonard couldn't stop thinking about Rose. He counted the hours until Monday when he could see her again on his walk home. This continued for nearly 2 months, with Rose seeming to understand Leonard better than he understood himself. She said things that made him feel invincible, made him believe everything would work out perfectly, that only the two of them mattered in the entire world. Leonard realized early on that he'd fallen in love with her. But as the weeks passed, his infatuation grew more intense, consuming him whether she was present or not. He tried to control himself, knowing it was wrong, but one day, it burst out of him like a dam breaking. He confessed his love, told her he wanted to spend his life with her. But Rose knew Leonard was married. She told him what he wanted was impossible. Abandoning his wife and infant would condemn them to starvation or the poorhouse, institutions, plagued with disease and death back then. No place for a woman and baby alone. If Leonard and Rose were going to be together, Rose insisted he needed to do something first. Send his wife and infant daughter to heaven. She asked if they were pure and free of sin. When Leonard confirmed they were, Rose suggested there'd be no greater gift than granting them eternal paradise. She convinced him this would ultimately benefit everyone involved, especially his wife and baby, who would forgive him once they understood. And they would understand, because eventually everyone would understand. He described it as being intoxicated without drinking. Rose had twisted his thinking until something utterly wrong seemed not just reasonable but brilliant. So that night, after arranging to meet Rose at a specific location, Leonard retrieved the hatchet from behind his house, waited until they were asleep, and murdered them both. Afterward, he cleaned himself up, changed clothes, and ran into the woods to meet Rose at their agreed-upon spot. He raced through the trees, thinking about his future happiness, trying to push the horrible images further from his mind. But when he arrived at their meeting place exactly on time, Rose was nowhere to be found. Leonard didn't leave immediately. He waited 1 hour, then 2, calling her name and searching the area. But as dawn approached, he spotted something. A small wooden figure, no larger than a child's toy, sitting in the center of their meeting place. When he picked it up and realized it resembled Rose, the truth hit him. He'd been completely deceived. He didn't want to accept it at first. Who would? But as he walked back toward what had been his home, reality crashed down on him. He sat at his kitchen table, drank every drop of illegal liquor he had hidden away. This was during Prohibition, then walked all the way to town to confess. After his confession, the sheriff officially placed Leonard under arrest, which confused him since he thought he already was. He then slept for nearly 24 hours, though his rest was constantly interrupted by nightmares. Every few hours, Leonard would wake screaming, then cry himself back to sleep, apologizing to a wife and daughter who could no longer hear him. It was an unspeakable crime, but Leonard wasn't the only one to commit such an atrocity around that time. Just past noon, another deputy burst into the office reporting a triple murder in a nearby town. A neighbor had gone to check on the Caldwell family, William, his wife, and their 2 young sons, because nobody had seen them all morning, and the boys hadn't shown up at school. She entered the house and discovered a scene from hell. Around the kitchen table lay the mutilated bodies of William Caldwell's wife and 2 sons, all shot multiple times. Deputies visited William's workplace and learned he hadn't reported for work. They searched the surrounding area, including a place locals called Whiskey Creek, where they found him. Caldwell's body was discolored, his eyes open and bloodshot, dried vomit staining his shirt. One hand still gripped the moonshine jug he'd emptied, and in the other hand was a small wooden figure, identical to the one Leonard Mills had found. The sheriff and his deputies were already stretched thin. They had officers watching the Mills house, and others at the Caldwell house. Everyone knew they faced a brutal week of investigations, but they didn't yet know about 2 more bodies waiting to be discovered. A fisherman near the lake was walking along the shore when he noticed something floating near the water's edge. As he got closer, he realized with horror it was a body, later identified as Alan Morgan, a local young man. Within an hour, 2 deputies were guarding the scene while investigators tried to determine what happened. The prevailing theory was that Alan had fallen from the nearby bridge while drunk or exhausted. There was always the possibility he'd been pushed. One deputy climbed onto the bridge to search for evidence of a struggle. He found something, but not what he expected. Sitting on one of the thick wooden railings was another small wooden figure, just like the ones connected to Mills and Caldwell. Over the following weeks, the Madison County Sheriff's Department worked tirelessly to understand these connected murders. Allen wasn't married, so if the wooden figure's presence meant he'd also killed someone, investigators wondered who the victim might be. Searching his residence provided a grim answer. Allen's sister, Catherine Morgan, was found in his bed. He'd killed her, gutted her, and was in the process of skinning her corpse before he apparently stopped and walked to the lake. Whatever happened on that bridge resulted in Allen falling to his death. Deputies investigated these cases for months with barely any rest, finally concluding there was nothing more they could do. Leonard Mills cooperated fully, telling them everything about Rose, until he realized he actually knew almost nothing about her. Despite months of nearly daily conversations, he didn't know where she was from, her family name, or where she'd been living. Deputies went door to door throughout the entire county, asking if anyone knew a woman matching Rose's description: red hair and piercing green eyes. The sheriff expected quick results, but he was wrong. The only person in all of Madison County who seemed aware of Rose's existence was Leonard Mills, the only living person anyway. The idea that this mysterious Rose had manipulated 3 different men into murdering their families seemed impossible. But considering all 3 crimes occurred the same night, and each man encountered one of those strange wooden figures, they were clearly connected somehow. Grandpa Tom said the sheriff theorized it must have been multiple women working together in some elaborate scheme. But that raised the question: what was the scheme? Nothing had been stolen from any crime scene. Leonard Mills said Rose never asked him for money, not even once. These women, if it was multiple women, seemed interested only in convincing Morgan, Caldwell, and Mills to murder their loved ones. After that, they vanished, leaving only those wooden figures behind. Naturally, law enforcement wanted to find the mysterious Rose, but the judge didn't care who she was. Leonard Mills had sworn on the Bible that he alone had murdered his wife and infant daughter. Therefore, the judge decided he alone would face execution. Mills's attorney, his family, even the sheriff believed he qualified for an insanity defense. But since Mills never sought anything but to confess, the judge had no choice but to impose the only appropriate punishment: death. Mills didn't object. He wanted to die. After years on death row, he got his wish. Nobody at the Madison County Sheriff's Department ever found anyone named Rose living in the area, nor anyone matching her description. It naturally became something of a legend among law enforcement, past and present. Then one day, Grandpa Tom visited a retired sheriff who'd served when Grandpa was young. He recounted the entire story of the 3 family murders from October 1924, much as I'm doing now. While telling it, Grandpa reached into his pocket and pulled out one of those wooden figures. Since the other 2 were locked in evidence, he figured borrowing one wouldn't hurt, especially wrapped in cloth, so he wouldn't contaminate it with fingerprints. When he handed the figure to the old sheriff and the man unwrapped it, he studied it briefly before his face went pale. Grandpa said the old sheriff looked up at him with an ashen expression and asked him to repeat the names of the men who'd murdered their families. Grandpa listed all 3 names. The old man then asked if Grandpa knew Mills's mother's maiden name. Grandpa had spoken with members of her family after the murders, but couldn't recall the family name. That's when the old sheriff asked, "Was it Crawford?" Grandpa nodded. It had been Crawford. When he asked how the old sheriff knew that, this is what he learned. When the old sheriff was just starting as a deputy back in the 1890s, he'd helped investigate the murder of an unmarried woman who lived in isolation. The woman, no older than 40, had been in town selling flowers she'd picked. After earning enough money, she bought a bottle of whiskey from the general store and drank it while walking home. The next morning, someone found her near the path to her home. She'd been stripped, violated, and shot through the eye. As a deputy, the old sheriff was assigned to go door to door seeking witnesses. After nearly 3 days with no luck, he finally found someone who'd seen something the evening of the murder. 3 local men, all in their 20s and 30s, had been spotted talking to the intoxicated woman as she left town. The witness could name 2 of them. The third was identified through association. All 3 were brought in for questioning, and for a while it looked like each would be convicted and hanged. But through some legal technicality, none of them spent even a single night in jail for what everyone believed they'd done. It was a terrible miscarriage of justice, so severe that each of the accused had to relocate their families out of town for fear of retaliation. The sheriff turned to my Grandpa Tom and asked if he could guess the family names of those accused men. Grandpa said he didn't need a second guess. When he said Caldwell, Morgan, and Crawford, the old sheriff simply nodded. Those men had moved their families away fearing retaliation. But when vengeance came, it wasn't visited upon them. It was visited upon their grandsons. Grandpa then asked what about the wooden figure had triggered that memory, because the change in the old sheriff's expression had made it obvious. The old sheriff held up the figure and pointed to something. Grandpa and his fellow deputies had always wondered about. One eye was large and round, the other a small, roughly carved pit. Grandpa had always suspected the figures carried some message, but he'd never deciphered it. After that visit to the old sheriff, the message became crystal clear. The figures represented the murdered woman, and this was her revenge. Following that revelation, everyone at the Madison County Sheriff's Department concluded Rose must have been one of the woman's distant relatives, perhaps the granddaughter, of a sibling she rarely saw, someone nobody knew about. No one had claimed her body, and the only mourners at her funeral were townspeople who'd heard her story. But that didn't mean she had no family who eventually learned of her murder, and the injustice that followed, then decided to take revenge in the only way they could. This next tale comes from before the Civil War, straight from the mountains of Highland County, Virginia. Though I've heard it countless times, it never fails to captivate me. It's a story about pride and wickedness, about beauty and goodness, and about how sometimes divine intervention occurs when evil goes too far. So, settle in, because this is the tale of Daniel, the plantation owner's son, and Sarah May, the prettiest girl in all of Highland County. Highland County sits deep in central Appalachia, where morning sun paints the hillsides golden and the moon hangs low over the valleys at night. People lived simply back then, working their land, tending livestock, and supporting each other through hardships. But even in good times, a shadow loomed over them. The great plantation perched high on the ridge like a monarch surveying subjects, with its vast fields worked by enslaved people. Down in the valley lived humble folk, including Sarah May's family. She was so beautiful she could silence a room simply by entering it. The plantation owner had a son named Daniel, a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and a charming smile that might deceive you if you didn't look carefully. But his heart was cold as winter ice. Growing up privileged with fine possessions and horses, Daniel had never been denied anything without throwing tantrums. As a child, he'd terrorize other children, stealing their belongings just to watch them cry. As he matured, his behavior worsened. He'd take things from the market, knowing his father would cover for him, while people whispered about the terrible things he'd done to enslaved people on the plantation. Things too awful to speak plainly. Then there was Sarah May. She was stunning. Hair like spun gold flowing down her back, eyes bluer than the sky after rain. But it wasn't just her appearance that made people love her. It was her enormous heart. Sarah May was always helping where needed. Her voice was sweet as birdsong, and she'd hum hymns while working, making everything feel right with the world. She'd bring bread baskets to the hungry, mend torn clothing for the poor, and sit beside the sick until they recovered. Her family lived in a small cabin near a meadow, and that's where this tale takes a dark turn. One day, Daniel decided he wanted Sarah May for himself. He dressed in his finest clothes, rode his black horse down to her cabin, and found her on the porch mending a quilt. He tipped his hat with that sly grin, wished her good morning, and told her she was the prettiest girl in the entire county before asking for her hand in marriage. Sarah May looked up from her stitching and said she hadn't realized he felt that way. Daniel confirmed it, adding that any girl for miles would kill to be in her position, and accepting would guarantee her a life of luxury in that big plantation house. But Sarah May wasn't swayed by fancy words or promises. She set down her quilt and met his eyes directly, telling him that while she was flattered, she didn't love him and couldn't marry a man she didn't love. Daniel's face turned red with anger. He reminded her he was the son of the wealthiest man in Highland County, and that she was rejecting a life most would beg for. Sarah May acknowledged that might be true, but she still couldn't marry without genuine love. That was the last straw. Daniel erupted in fury, shouting that she'd regret refusing him, then stormed off, leaving nothing but anger and scattered chickens behind. Daniel wasn't the type to let an insult go unanswered. He brooded in that big plantation house, his rage festering like an infected wound. Over the following days, he conceived a plan darker than coal. He knew Sarah May loved picking wildflowers in the meadows near her cabin, a peaceful spot surrounded by trees with flowers of every color. She went there almost daily, baskets swinging as she sang to herself. and that's where Daniel decided to ambush her. He planned to attack her, take what he wanted by force, then silence her permanently. To cover his tracks, he'd leave some cotton fibers on her body, directing blame toward one of his father's enslaved workers. It was a devil's scheme born of pure spite and poisonous pride, and Daniel intended to follow through. One sunny morning, Sarah May set out for the meadow with her empty basket, ready to gather flowers. Unknown to her, Daniel was watching from the ridge, his heart filled with hatred. Once she was out of sight, he slipped down quietly, following her toward the meadows. The weather looked favorable that morning, so the meadows must have been picturesque. Bees buzzing, birds singing, Sarah May's voice floating on the breeze. I imagine her wandering among the blooms, picking daisies and wildflowers with gentle hands before placing them in her basket. But there was Daniel, crouched low, watching from the tree line, waiting for the right moment to strike. Just as he prepared to spring forward, the sky turned gray. From seemingly nowhere, a dark cloud passed overhead, and distant thunder rumbled through the valley. It was a flash thunderstorm, the kind that sweeps in fast and fierce. Wind whipped through the grass as lightning split the sky. When thunder boomed, shaking the ground, Sarah May looked up with concern. She knew these storms, how they could drench you completely if you didn't seek shelter quickly. Quick as lightning herself, she gathered her flowers and ran for home while Daniel cursed under his breath. He'd waited patiently, and now the storm was ruining his chance. He vowed to try again another day, but fate had different plans. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving cool air and wet ground behind. A traveling merchant was trudging along the road near the meadow when he spotted something odd lying by the roadside. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree or perhaps a dead animal. But as he approached, his stomach turned. It was Daniel, or what remained of him. His body was blackened and twisted, his clothes burned completely off, and the stench of charred flesh hung so heavy in the air it would turn the strongest stomach. Lightning had struck him dead. The merchant crossed himself, muttered a prayer, then hurried to the nearest farm to spread the word. News traveled through the county faster than wildfire. People gathered in town, buzzing about Daniel's death. Some said they'd always known he'd meet a bad end, that he was rotten to his core. Others suggested it was a guardian angel protecting Sarah May, as word of Daniel's marriage proposal had spread through town. Sarah May herself remained quiet. Some said there was relief in her eyes, but also a touch of sorrow. She'd been spared, but it was a heavy burden for a soul like hers to carry. Before long, life returned to its normal rhythm, but the tale of Daniel and Sarah May grew roots. People would tell it around fires, pass it down like an heirloom, and use it to encourage good behavior in their children. "Remember Daniel," they'd say, "who thought he could take what he wanted, but the Lord sent a lightning bolt to set things right." Sarah May lived a long, happy life, marrying a good man who truly loved her. She had sons who carried their father's strength and her kindness. She moved forward but never forgot that day in the meadow. Some say she believed until her last breath that a higher power had intervened to save her. So there's your story, straight from those ancient hills of Appalachia. Pride and cruelty lead to ruin, but goodness and faith will see you through. The Lord watches over us, and sometimes His justice strikes as swift as lightning. On January 19, 1971, two college freshmen from Marshall University decided to hitchhike back to their dormitory after watching a movie in downtown Huntington, West Virginia. During the film's intermission, Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole ran into two fellow Marshall students, Barbara Hayes and her boyfriend Marcus Freeman. The group chatted in the theater lobby while buying refreshments, then sat together for the movie's second half. After the film ended, all four students walked toward Jefferson Avenue. But when a tan-colored sedan drove past them, either Jennifer or Susan stuck out her thumb. The sedan stopped. Barbara and Marcus watched as both girls climbed into the vehicle's front bench seat. They expected to see them back at the campus dorms, but neither Jennifer nor Susan would ever be seen alive again. Barbara Hayes might have been a college freshman, but she wasn't naive. She understood hitchhiking carried inherent risks. So when she returned to the Marshall dorms and discovered neither Jennifer nor Susan were anywhere to be found, she grew concerned. She asked around the dorms, checked their rooms multiple times, and after another hour passed, she contacted law enforcement to report them missing. Barbara was convinced something was wrong, but the officers at the Huntington Police Department didn't share her sense of urgency. The girls had only been gone a few hours, and while Barbara's concern was touching, it was perhaps premature. The officers knew college students, especially those near the Appalachian wilderness, were prone to spontaneous adventures. In all likelihood, Jennifer and Susan would return within a day or two, but they were tragically wrong. After several days passed with no sign of the girls at their Marshall dormitory, Barbara called police again. Only then did they act on her report. Officers contacted the girls' roommates and parents to gather information before issuing a public appeal regarding their whereabouts. Photographs of both girls were released along with details of their last known sighting, but frustratingly, nobody came forward. 6 long weeks passed before the first break in the case, but when it came, it didn't bode well for the missing girls' safety. A teenager participating in a highway cleanup program found Jennifer's handbag among the roadside vegetation. A few weeks later, on April 10, 1971, the West Virginia State Police received an anonymous letter postmarked in Clarksburg, West Virginia, just 3 days prior. It read, "Gentlemen, I have information regarding the location of the bodies of the 2 missing Marshall University students, Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole. Follow these directions precisely, and you cannot fail to find them. Proceed 28 miles directly south from Huntington's southern boundary. This will bring you to a forested area. Enter the forest exactly 1 mile. There are the bodies. 28 plus 1 equals 29 miles total. I will reveal myself when the bodies are located." The letter was signed with only a crudely drawn circle. Days later, while police were still investigating the anonymous letter, they received a second. Many believed it was prompted by publication of the first letter in a local newspaper. Like the initial correspondence, it was postmarked in West Virginia and signed with only a circle. "Gentlemen," it read, "I saw the article in this morning's newspaper concerning my previous letter about the missing students. If you reread my first letter carefully, you will see the directions were specific. Directly south from the city, meaning Huntington's southern limit. Straight south 28 miles, you will reach a forested woodland. Enter 1 mile south, fanning out. You will locate the girls' bodies covered with brush. Look carefully. The animals are now active. Trust this will help with the exact location. Will still identify myself when bodies are located. Sincerely, Circle." Once the public learned of the letter's contents, widespread outcry prompted West Virginia's governor to order a search based on the directions provided. This search yielded items, including Jennifer's sunglasses along with Susan's handbag and driver's license, scattered between 150 and 200 feet off the road. This suggested someone had deliberately hidden them rather than simply tossing them from a car window. Obviously, law enforcement found the letter's mention of bodies extremely discouraging. But just 2 days after the governor's mandated search, their worst fears were confirmed. On April 18th, the bodies of Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole were found 13 miles south of Huntington, not the 29 stated in the letters. Both had been decapitated. The bodies had been placed one on top of the other, the bottom body face up, the top body face down. Both wore the same clothes they'd been wearing when they vanished. They were also covered with flat stones apparently brought from a nearby creek bed. These stones were later described as resembling grave markers. There was also a fallen tree across the bodies, though whether its placement was intentional remained unclear. Due to advanced decomposition, it was impossible to determine if the girls had been assaulted prior to death. However, since their clothing appeared undisturbed, a pack of cigarettes tucked in Jennifer's jeans waistband was still there. This was considered unlikely. Not only were the girls' severed heads missing, but the necklaces each had been wearing at the time of their abduction were also unaccounted for, as were a fur hat and fur gloves one of them had been wearing. In the days that followed, 2 more letters signed only with circles were sent. One to West Virginia State Police, the other addressed to Jennifer Watson's parents. Each provided directions to the location of the girls' severed heads. A third letter dated April 23rd was sent to Huntington Police. The heads can be found from the body location by heading 12 degrees southwest for the first head and approximately 12 degrees southeast for the second. Roughly 1 mile. You are already 3/4 of that mile. They are within the mine entrance, if you can call it an entrance given its condition. They are buried no more than 1 foot deep. Those responsible scattered some of the girls' personal effects throughout the area, creating confusion, making it difficult to pinpoint any exact location. My first 2 letters triggered your intensive search. Don't give up now. Sincerely, Circle. A final letter dated April 30th was sent to Jennifer's parents. I have sent 3 letters to the West Virginia State Police concerning your daughter, Jennifer. The first and second were taken seriously and led to a search that successfully located 2 bodies minus the heads, which were needed for other purposes. Suddenly, the police are complaining about an error in my stated mileage. After driving in irregular patterns for 29 miles under January, weather conditions and the involved circumstances, it is impossible to avoid approximately a 16-mile error in the precise location. Nevertheless, they were found south of Huntington as stated, even along what was called a logging lane or old mine road. In my opinion, both the same. Police believe the circle letters author was their primary suspect in the murders, and early investigation stages centered on this theory. However, following analysis of one letter, police traced them back to 3 members of a small religious group called the Spiritual Insight Society. When they confronted the group's leader, Reverend Harold Mitchell, he claimed the ability to communicate with spirits from another realm, and that information in the letters had been provided by these spirits. Officers were stunned. Not only were the letters a distasteful hoax, but the author offered no apologies whatsoever. After the Spiritual Insight Society was cleared of any involvement in the girls' murders, the investigation slowed considerably. But years later, in 1977, a man named Frank Dawson shocked everyone by confessing to the murders. Dawson had lived in the nearby town of Milton most of his life. He was also a convicted child abuser, and at the time of his confession was serving time in a Pennsylvania prison for related offenses. When he first contacted West Virginia State Police, he claimed to be having nightmares based on his memories of the murders. Following a lengthy interview, he wrote a 40-page confession after passing a polygraph test. However, during this polygraph test, Dawson displayed complete ignorance regarding intimate case details. In his confession, he made numerous incorrect statements, such as claiming he'd laid the bodies side by side, or that he'd forced them into the back seat rather than the front seat, as confirmed by Barbara Hayes. Weston would later be convicted of kidnapping and draining the blood of a 21-year-old woman named Patricia Murphy, who would have died from blood loss within hours if she hadn't managed to escape Weston's grasp. To this day, no concrete evidence places Weston in Huntington on the date of the murders, but he had reason to be there, a deeply disturbing one. Some have alleged that in early 1971, Thomas Weston was conducting a romantic relationship with his own sister. Since that relationship had to be kept secret, neither Weston nor his sister would announce or admit a visit had occurred. But if one had, and Weston's sister decided to end their unnatural affair, is it possible that a scorned and furious young psychopath would redirect his rage toward 2 helpless hitchhikers? Another suspect in what became known as the Marshall co-ed murders was a man named Raymond Turner. Turner had worked as a maintenance worker at Marshall's Henderson Hall, the very dorm where Jennifer and Susan had been staying, but he'd quit in early 1971 for undisclosed reasons. In early April, just weeks after the girls were murdered, a woman filed a report with Huntington police regarding a frightening encounter at a service station. She'd been waiting in line when a strange man began offering her a ride. She refused, but was somehow convinced to wait in the man's car until her friends arrived. The man proceeded to make her extremely uncomfortable, especially once he became fixated on her fur coat and hat. He said he liked touching furry things and raised a hand toward her. The woman immediately fled from his car and reported the interaction to police. But since this occurred before the discovery of Jennifer and Susan's bodies, officers couldn't see the connection between the strange man's obsession with fur and the furry items missing from the girls' bodies. Following the girls' disappearance, law enforcement tracked down the man's employer. Not only did they discover his name was Raymond Turner, but Mr. Turner had called in sick on the morning of January 19th, the very same day Jennifer and Susan went missing. Hoping to connect him to the circle letters, officers visited Turner's residence to obtain a handwriting sample. But comparison showed few similarities between Turner's handwriting and that found in the circle letters. This caused them to prematurely dismiss Turner as a suspect. By the time they realized the letters had been written by the Spiritual Insight Society, the number of potential suspects had grown so vast that Turner was never revisited. Around the same time Turner was being reconsidered as a suspect, police again appealed to the public for information. Shortly after, they received a call regarding a man named Vincent Bird, a Huntington resident with a reputation for starting fires and harming animals. There was another significant problem with Dawson's confession. He claimed to have assaulted both girls multiple times each, yet it was discovered Dawson suffered from a severe medical condition resulting in complete physical dysfunction. Medical professionals stated his condition was so severe that what he described would be physically impossible. Yet just when Dawson's claims seemed worthless, one of his assertions actually advanced the investigation. When asked where he'd disposed of the severed heads, Dawson claimed he'd thrown them into a crevice at an old schoolyard. Police conducted a thorough search, discovering Dawson was again fabricating information. However, after analyzing a bird's nest in the area, police found human hairs visually matching those of Susan and Jennifer. These hairs had no roots attached, leading investigators to believe they'd been cut, not pulled from the victims' heads. Someone hadn't just severed the girls' heads, they'd cut their hair as well. Dawson was officially charged with the murders of Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole, but by his trial date, he'd completely reversed his confession. Since he'd passed a polygraph, it's clear that at some point, Dawson genuinely believed in his own guilt. Following his conviction, he launched a successful appeal claiming he'd knowingly made false statements during trial. At his 1981 retrial, Dawson claimed he'd issued a false confession to escape charges in Pennsylvania, but he was again found guilty. Dawson continued professing his innocence until his death in 2010, and received some vindication when, in 2007, the West Virginia State Police reopened the investigation. Dawson was never fully exonerated, but if he didn't kill Jennifer and Susan, who did? In December 1971, Robert Hayes was arrested in Pittsburgh for beheading a man named Carl Bennett. Following Bennett's decapitation, Hayes drove his severed head to a rural area and placed it under a flat rock near a creek. Born in 1898, Hayes' family had moved to West Virginia when he was in elementary school, and he briefly worked at a mine, less than 2 miles from where Jennifer and Susan's bodies were found. Between 1922 and 1953, there were multiple unsolved decapitations in areas where Hayes resided. He was eventually arrested and imprisoned for one such beheading in 1953, only to be released 15 years later in 1968. The same year Hayes was released, another unsolved beheading occurred. 2 similar crimes happened the following year, with another in 1970. Notably, once Hayes was imprisoned for Carl Bennett's murder in 1971, the string of mysterious decapitations suddenly stopped. Another name on the police suspect list was Thomas Bradley Weston. Weston's father worked for a company that owned the land where Jennifer and Susan's bodies were found. Not only was Weston on university break in January 1971, but his older sister was enrolled at Marshall. Officers from the local police department decided to pay him a visit. While Bird was initially cooperative, he became hostile when they asked what kind of car he'd been driving in early 1971. The question had exposed a convenient gap in his otherwise perfect recollection. After becoming argumentative, he demanded the officers leave his residence. The 2 men complied, thanking him as they headed toward the door. But on the way out, one officer glanced at a framed photograph hanging on Bird's wall and realized he recognized the person in it. The man in the photograph was Raymond Turner, and Vincent Bird was his nephew. Was Turner directly responsible for Jennifer and Susan's disappearance? Or did his own flesh and blood bring them to him hoping to win his approval? The aforementioned individuals constitute just a fraction of the complete list of suspects, and the sheer number of them made finding the girl's killer much more difficult. Yet according to some, the investigation was further hampered by West Virginia's own government. During April of 1972, a West Virginia state trooper named Gerald P. Richardson claimed his employers at the Department of Public Safety had, and I quote, lied about department activity in reference to the murders of Jennifer and Susan. Trooper Richardson also claimed he could provide documentary evidence proving this, adding that a representative of the state governor was interfering in the case for political reasons. One example he gave was the case of Sergeant Michael D'Angelo, who was transferred to a different regional office after insisting the wrong leads were being followed. Trooper Richardson also claimed that Sergeant D'Angelo had been rapidly advancing. An investigation into the car bombing of a vehicle owned by Cabell County, Prosecutor David Martinez, Jr. Mr. Martinez had been conducting a vigorous campaign against gambling and organized crime in his county when a professionally wired car bomb exploded in his driveway. He underwent surgery to treat severe wounds to his right leg and right arm. Thankfully, he survived his injuries, but his right hand was permanently disabled. Mr. Martinez continued practicing law but declined to run for re-election. Trooper Richardson, on the other hand, was promptly dismissed as a West Virginia state trooper. 7 years later, Trooper Richardson sued the West Virginia Department of Public Safety, claiming his dismissal violated his First Amendment rights. The court heard how Richardson had been charged with insubordination after alleging the department's promotional system was, and I quote, based on who you socialize with, or who you know rather than on merit. Richardson also alleged there was, quote, a system that permits an officer to associate with known criminals and still reach a rank of leadership, and that the department reflected a system that still has not learned that professional police work and politics do not mix. A judge later determined that Trooper Richardson's constitutional rights had indeed been violated, and it's believed he was awarded a substantial settlement as a result. But perhaps the reason the state governor, Howard Alexander Mitchell, reacted so ruthlessly to accusations of corruption is because they were true. In 1991, and following an extensive federal investigation, Mitchell pleaded guilty to 6 felonies, including mail fraud, tax fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice. Not only had he accepted illegal payments and extorted over $600,000 from the Consolidated Energy Corporation, he'd conspired to derail investigations into his own corruption. This may well have included the car bombing Sergeant D'Angelo had been investigating, and quite possibly the murders of Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole. Mitchell was punished with a $3.5 million fine and sentenced to just under 7 years in prison. He ended up paying less than a quarter of his fine, and he served only 2.5 years before serving out the remaining 5 months of his vastly reduced sentence at his home in Meadowbrook, West Virginia. As a result of his conviction, Mitchell was banned from practicing law in the state. During the final years of his life, he fought vehemently to be reinstated. "I followed the advice that I got, and it was not the right advice," he said, referring to his decision to cheat, lie, and steal from the people he claimed to serve. "Being a lawyer is something I always wanted to be. It's what I was and what I am." Thankfully, Mitchell's attempts were unsuccessful, but any links he might have had to the murders of Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole were never established. Frank Dawson might have died with a conviction hanging over him, but it's quite clear he was not Jennifer and Susan's murderer. Yet whether it was Hayes, Turner, Weston, or Byrd who took their lives seems almost irrelevant at this point. The world will always be full of monsters, people who lure the innocent into deadly traps. But we've already established proven systems by which they can be caught, captured, or even stopped before they strike. The final 4 words of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance read, "and justice for all." Yet when corrupt individuals wear masks of virtue and poison those systems with the slow venom of self-service, there is justice for none. Because there is no fighting the monsters without unless we first vanquish those within. I grew up in a small mountain town in West Virginia called Marlinton. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone and there's not much to do except spend time outdoors. When I was around 15 back in 2008, a group of us decided to camp out on my friend's family property. It was pretty far from town, up near the National Forest, and his parents had this old farmhouse they barely used anymore. There were 5 of us that night. My best friend Jake, his younger brother Matt, 2 guys from our class named David and Chris, and me. We'd all grown up together, spent countless nights at each other's houses. So camping out felt like no big deal. We'd done it before on other properties closer to town, but this spot was different, more isolated. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel road, and behind it, the forest stretched for miles without another building in sight. We set up our tents at the edge of the property where the yard met the tree line. The grass was overgrown and the whole place had this abandoned feel to it, even though Jake's family still owned it. We built a fire in an old stone pit someone had made years ago, cooked hot dogs, told stupid jokes, normal teenager stuff. As it got darker, the woods behind us seemed to press in closer. The tree line was maybe 30 feet from our tents, and once the sun went down, you couldn't see anything past the first few trees, just solid black. Around 9 or 10, we started telling scary stories. Someone brought up the old local legend about something that lived in the woods. Different people called it different things. Some said it was a spirit, others said it was something physical but not quite human. The story went that it wandered the forest at night, looking for people who were alone or asleep. And if it found you, it would take you back into the woods, and you'd never be seen again. We laughed about it, but there was an edge to the laughter. We all knew the stories. We'd all heard them our whole lives from older kids, from parents trying to keep us from wandering too far into the forest. And being out there in the dark with nothing but a campfire between us and those woods made it feel a little too real. Jake's brother Matt was the youngest, only 13, and I could tell the stories were getting to him. He kept glancing over his shoulder at the trees. Jake noticed too and told him to relax, that it was all just made-up stuff to scare tourists. But even Jake's voice had lost some of its confidence. Around 11, we decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to coals, and we were all tired from hiking around earlier in the day. I was sharing a tent with Jake. We laid there talking for a while about school, about this girl he liked, just random stuff. Eventually, his breathing got slow and even, and I knew he'd fallen asleep. I was still awake, just staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets mostly, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. That's when I heard something different. At first, it sounded like footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps moving through the leaves and grass. I assumed it was one of the other guys getting up to pee or something. We'd all had soda with dinner, but then the footsteps started moving in a circle around our tents. Not fast, just steady and deliberate. Around and around. And no one was calling out or using a flashlight. I sat up and whispered to Jake. He woke up instantly. And I could tell from the way he went completely still that he heard it too. The footsteps kept circling. They'd pass by our tent, fade a little as they moved to the other side of the camp, then come back around. Over and over. None of the other guys came out of their tents. No one said anything. That's when I realized they were hearing it too, and were just as scared as we were. Then the footsteps stopped. Just like that. Complete silence. Even the crickets had gone quiet. I held my breath, waiting. Jake's hand found my arm in the dark, and he squeezed hard enough to hurt. We stayed like that, frozen for what felt like forever. Then a new sound started. It was quieter than the footsteps, almost like a whisper, but not quite. More like breathing, heavy and wet. And it was moving around us the same way the footsteps had, close enough that I swear I could feel it. The side of our tent moved slightly, like something had brushed against it. Jake leaned close to my ear and whispered so quietly I almost couldn't hear him. He said we needed to stay completely still and silent. Don't move, don't talk, don't even breathe loud. I didn't understand why at first, but something in his voice, the pure terror in it, told me to listen. So we just laid there, barely breathing, while this thing kept circling our tent. The breathing sound would get close, then fade, then come back. Sometimes it would stop right outside our tent for long seconds before moving on. I don't know how long it lasted. Time felt strange out there. My legs were cramping from staying in one position, but I was too scared to move even an inch. My heart was beating so hard I thought whatever was out there would hear it. At some point I realized I was crying. Silent tears just running down my face. Jake was shaking next to me. Eventually, slowly, the sound started to fade. It moved away from our tents, back toward the tree line, getting quieter and quieter, and then it was gone. The crickets started up again. The normal sounds of the night returned, but we didn't move. We stayed exactly where we were until the first gray light of dawn started, coming through the tent fabric. As soon as it was light enough to see, we heard movement from the other tents. Matt came out first, his face pale and his eyes red like he'd been crying. Then David and Chris. Nobody said anything at first. We just looked at each other. Then we packed. Fast. We didn't talk about what to take or what to leave. We just threw everything into bags and got out of there. Back at Jake's house in town, we finally talked about it. Every single one of us had heard the same thing. The footsteps circling the camp. The breathing sound. And we'd all had the same instinct to stay completely still and quiet. Matt admitted he'd been so scared he'd wet himself a little. Nobody made fun of him. We were all pretty shaken up. That's when Jake told us what his grandfather had told him years ago. His grandfather had grown up in those mountains, spent his whole life there. He'd told Jake about the thing in the woods. He called it the Circler, said it was something old, older than the towns, older than the roads. It wandered the forest looking for living things. It was drawn to movement and sound, to anything that showed you were alive. But if you stayed completely still, if you didn't move or make noise, it would think you were already dead, and it would leave you alone. His grandfather said he'd encountered it twice in his life. Both times he'd survived by playing dead. I'm 31 now. I moved away from Marlinton years ago. I live in a city now, work a normal job, have a normal life. And rationally, logically, I know it was probably just an animal. A bear, maybe. They live in those mountains. Or maybe it was a person, some drunk or crazy person wandering around. That makes sense. That's the explanation that fits with how the world is supposed to work. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that sound, the way it circled our tents, patient and methodical, the wet breathing sound that came right up against the fabric. And I remember the absolute terror I felt, lying there in the dark next to Jake, both of us pretending to be dead. I remember how it felt like the thing knew we were there, like it was testing us, waiting for one of us to move or cry out. And I think about Jake's grandfather, who survived 2 encounters with the same thing. I wonder what he saw those 2 times, what it looked like if he ever got a glimpse of it. He died a few years after that camping trip, and I never got the chance to ask him. Sometimes I'm grateful for that. Some things maybe we're not supposed to know. Some questions are better left unasked. I haven't been camping since that night. I tell people it's because I'm too busy with work, or because I prefer hotels now that I can afford them. And that's partly true. But the real reason is that I'm afraid of what might be out there in the dark woods. Walking in circles, breathing in the night, looking for signs of life. This happened back in October 2019. My husband and I had been looking forward to this trip for months. We both worked demanding jobs in the city and desperately needed a break from everything. Work had been intense, we'd been dealing with family stuff, and we just wanted a few days where we could disconnect and breathe. We found this rental property online, a small cottage tucked away in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The pictures looked beautiful. Wooden beams, a stone fireplace, big windows looking out into the forest. It was exactly what we needed. Perfect. The drive up took longer than we expected. We left early on a Friday morning, thinking we'd get there by early afternoon. But the directions got complicated once we left the highway. The paved road eventually turned to gravel, and then the gravel turned into this narrow dirt path that made our little sedan bounce and scrape along the bottom. My husband kept joking that we were going to get stuck out there and have to walk back to civilization. I laughed, but part of me was genuinely worried. We didn't see another car or house for the last 40 minutes of the drive. By the time we arrived, it was already getting dark. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and everything had that orange and purple glow that looks beautiful but also means you're running out of daylight. The cottage looked just like the photos, maybe a bit smaller in person but charming. It had that rustic cabin feel but seemed well maintained. The porch was swept clean and there were fresh flowers in a pot by the door. We unloaded our bags, found the key where the owner said it would be, and let ourselves in. The inside was cozy. One main room with the kitchen and living area combined, a small bedroom off to the side, and a bathroom that looked like it had been recently updated. Everything felt fine at first. We made dinner on the little stove, opened a bottle of wine we'd brought, and sat by the fireplace watching the flames. It was exactly what we needed. We talked about taking some hikes the next day, maybe driving into the nearest town to see if there were any cute shops or restaurants. Normal vacation stuff. But when we went to bed that night, something felt off. I can't explain it properly even now. It wasn't a sound, or a smell, or anything I could point to and say that's what's wrong. It was more like a presence, like the air in the room was too heavy, like the walls were watching us. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's the only way I can describe it. I woke up around 3 in the morning. My heart was pounding and I had no idea why. One second I was asleep, the next I was wide awake with my pulse racing. I just laid there in the dark, listening. My husband was asleep next to me, breathing slow and steady. The house was quiet, but I couldn't shake this overwhelming sense that someone else was there, that we weren't alone. I kept staring at the darkest corner of the room, the one by the closet door, and I swear I could see something there, a shape that was slightly darker than the surrounding darkness. But every time I tried to focus on it, it seemed to disappear. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just shadows in my imagination. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, I managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted, like I hadn't slept at all. I didn't mention anything to my husband. I didn't want to sound paranoid or ruin the vacation over a feeling. We'd spent good money on this place and driven all that way. I wasn't about to turn it into a disaster because I got spooked in the middle of the night. But at breakfast, I noticed my husband looked tired too. He was quiet, staring into his coffee. I asked if he'd slept okay. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was trying to decide whether to say something. Then he asked if I had gotten up during the night. I said no and asked why. He put his coffee down and rubbed his face. He told me he'd had the strangest dream. He dreamed there was a man standing in the corner of our bedroom, just standing there in the dark, staring at us while we slept. He said it felt so real that he actually woke up and looked, but of course there was nothing there, just the dark corner by the closet. I felt all the blood drain out of my face. My hands went cold. I hadn't told him anything about how I felt, about waking up and sensing someone there, about staring at that exact same corner. And here he was describing the exact same thing. We both sat there for a minute, not saying anything. Then we both tried to laugh it off at the same time. We blamed it on being in a strange place, on drinking wine before bed, on the house being old and making weird noises, all of that. But neither of us really believed it. I could see it in his eyes. He was just as unsettled as I was. We decided to get out of the cottage for the day. We spent hours hiking on some nearby trails. It was beautiful out there. The leaves were changing color, all these brilliant reds and oranges and yellows, and the air was crisp and clean. We took pictures, found a little waterfall, ate our packed lunch on a big flat rock. By the time we got back to the cottage in the late afternoon, we were both exhausted. We'd walked probably 8 or 9 miles. We ate a simple dinner. Neither of us had the energy to cook anything elaborate, and went to bed early. I was so tired I thought I'd sleep straight through the night. But again, around 3 in the morning I woke up, and this time I wasn't alone. My husband was sitting up in bed, completely rigid. His whole body was tense. I whispered his name and he grabbed my hand without looking at me. His hand was ice cold. He whispered back, asking if I could hear it. I held my breath and listened. There was a sound, faint but definitely there. It was coming from inside the walls, a sort of scratching, shifting sound, like someone moving around in a space that was way too small for them, like someone dragging fabric against wood. We both sat there, frozen, listening to this sound move along the wall beside our bed. It started near the headboard, traveled slowly down the length of the wall, and then stopped somewhere near the foot of the bed. Complete silence. We stayed like that, holding hands, barely breathing for what felt like hours. Neither of us said a word. We were both too scared to speak. When the sound didn't come back, we still didn't move. We just laid there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening. We didn't sleep another minute that night. We just waited for the sun to come up. As soon as the first light started coming through the window, we got out of bed. We didn't even discuss it. We both knew we were leaving. We started packing our things right away. That's when I went into the kitchen to grab the food we'd left in the fridge. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a seam in the wooden paneling on the wall by the counter. At first I thought it was just the way the panels were fitted together. But then I looked closer and realized it was too straight, too deliberate. It looked like it had been cut and fitted back into place. I called my husband over and we both stared at it. He reached out and pushed on it. It moved. Just slightly, but it definitely moved. We looked at each other and I could see the fear in his eyes that I knew was reflected in mine. He pushed harder and the whole panel shifted. It wasn't attached to the wall. It was just fitted into place. Behind it was a narrow gap, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they turned sideways. My husband pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. Inside was a crawl space that ran along the interior walls of the cottage. It was maybe 2 feet wide and went in both directions. We could see it extended toward the bedroom. There were blankets in there, old and dirty. Empty food wrappers, the kind from convenience stores. A flashlight that wasn't on but looked relatively new. And worst of all, there were small holes drilled through the walls at eye level. We followed the crawl space with the phone light and saw that the holes were positioned to look into the bedroom and the bathroom. You could see directly into both rooms from inside the walls. I felt sick. My legs went weak, and I had to sit down on the floor. My husband was shaking. We both understood in that moment what had happened. Someone had been living in the walls of the cottage. Someone had been watching us. The feeling of being observed, the shape in the corner, the sounds we heard, it was all real. Someone had been there with us the entire time, just inches away, hidden in the walls. We didn't touch anything else. We didn't take pictures. We just closed the panel, grabbed our bags, and left. We didn't even make sure we had everything. We just got in the car and drove. My husband called the property owner from the road. He told him what we found. The owner tried to act shocked, asking all these questions, but something about his reaction felt rehearsed, like he'd had this conversation before. He offered to refund us immediately, which seemed suspicious. Why wouldn't he want to call the police first or investigate? He just wanted to refund us and make us go away. We filed a police report when we got back home. We gave them all the information, the address, the owner's name, everything. I don't know what came of it because we never followed up. We just wanted to forget the whole thing. We wanted to pretend it never happened and move on with our lives. But every now and then, usually late at night when I can't sleep, I think about those 2 nights we spent there. I think about waking up and sensing someone in the room. I think about the sounds in the walls. And I wonder if someone really was watching us the whole time. Just inches away, hidden inside the walls, looking at us through those holes while we slept. I wonder what they were thinking, what they wanted. And I'm grateful we found that panel when we did, because I don't know what would have happened if we'd stayed another night. I'm a freelance photographer, and I'd been going through a rough patch when this happened. Work was slow. My relationship had just ended, and I was feeling pretty lost. A friend suggested I take some time away, maybe go somewhere quiet to clear my head and work on some personal projects. I thought it sounded like a good idea. I found this cabin rental on a smaller website, not one of the big ones. It was deep in the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. The listing said it was about 5 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail. No electricity, no running water, just a basic shelter with a wood stove. That appealed to me. I wanted to disconnect completely. I packed light, my camera equipment, some camping supplies, enough food for 4 days. The hike in was harder than I expected. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to stop several times to check my map. But when I finally found the cabin, it felt worth it. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by massive old trees. The silence out there was incredible. Not peaceful exactly, but powerful, like the forest itself was alive and breathing. The first day was good. I spent it exploring the area, taking photos, gathering firewood. As the sun started to set, I cooked a simple meal on the wood stove and settled in with a book. That's when I heard something outside. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. They circled the cabin once, then stopped near the front door. I stood up and called out, asking if anyone was there. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. There was no one. Just darkness and trees. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. I went back inside and locked the door. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound made me jump. And there were a lot of sounds. Branches scraping against the roof, the wind rattling the windows. And underneath all of that, occasionally, the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch outside. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to get some fresh air. That's when I saw him. A man was standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. He was just standing there looking at me. I raised my hand to wave, trying to be friendly. He didn't move, didn't wave back, just stared. I called out good morning. Still nothing. I started walking toward him, thinking maybe he needed help or was lost. But as soon as I took a few steps forward, he stepped back, deeper into the trees. I stopped. Something about the way he moved made my stomach drop. It wasn't natural. He wasn't walking like someone who was lost or confused. He was watching me, tracking me. I went back inside the cabin and locked the door. I watched through the window and saw him again. In a different spot this time, closer to the cabin. He was holding something long in his hand. It looked like a tool of some kind. Maybe a machete or a long knife. My hand started shaking. I spent the rest of that day inside, watching through the gaps in the curtains. He kept moving around the clearing, always staying just far enough away that I couldn't see his face clearly, but he never left. Every time I looked, he was there somewhere, standing perfectly still among the trees. By nightfall, I was terrified. I had no way to call for help. My phone had no signal and wouldn't have mattered, anyway, since the battery was almost dead. I was 5 miles from the nearest road with a stranger circling my cabin. I tried to think rationally. Maybe he was just another hiker. Maybe he was mentally ill and harmless. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the cabin with my back against the wall, holding a knife I'd brought for cooking. I kept the flashlight off so he wouldn't know I was awake, and I listened. Around midnight, I heard him on the porch again. This time he wasn't just walking. He was trying the door handle, gently at first, then harder. When that didn't work, he moved to the windows. I could hear him testing each one, pushing against the frames. I was so scared I could barely breathe. Then everything went quiet. I waited. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Nothing. I started to think maybe he'd given up and left. That's when I heard something that made my blood freeze. He was on the roof. I could hear his footsteps directly above me, slow and deliberate, like he was looking for a way in. I don't know how long he stayed up there. It felt like hours. Eventually, the sound stopped. I waited until the first light of dawn started coming through the windows. Then I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't follow the trail. I just ran in what I thought was the direction of the road. I got lost multiple times, tore my jacket on branches, twisted my ankle, but I didn't stop until I could hear cars in the distance. When I finally made it to the road, I flagged down a driver who took me to the nearest town. I reported everything to the police. They said they'd send someone out to check the cabin, but I never heard back about what they found. Part of me doesn't want to know. I still don't know who that man was, or what he wanted, but I think about him sometimes, standing there in the trees, watching and waiting. And I'm grateful I made it out.